A Sith Lord once tried to create life that obeyed only her, not soldiers, not apprentices, something far worse. Creatures that were neither alive nor machines. Creatures that could spread like a sickness across the galaxy. Even the Sith, a people who worshipped power above all things, looked at her work and felt something rare, fear, because she was not trying to conquer the galaxy. She was trying to rewrite it. This is the story of Belia Darzu, the Sith alchemist who tried to reshape life itself. But long before her name became something whispered in ancient Sith archives, before her laboratories filled with horrors born from the dark side, before entire Sith armies turned against her, Belia Darzu was only a child, a quiet child, and like many Sith who would later change the fate of the galaxy, her story began with something small, a feeling, something she sensed long before she understood what it meant. The Force surrounded every living being. Jedi spoke of it as balance, harmony, a natural current connecting all life. The Sith taught something very different. To them, the Force was domination, power, the will to bend the galaxy until it obeyed. But Belia Darzu did not feel the Force in either of those ways. She felt it, like a puzzle, something incomplete, something waiting to be understood. Even as a young initiate within the Sith Order, Darzu noticed patterns others ignored. When she focused through the Force, she could sense the strange relationship between life and the cold structure of machines. The dark side flowed easily through living flesh. That was well known. But sometimes, rarely, she could feel something stranger, a faint echo of that same power moving through technology. Most Sith would have ignored such a sensation. Their teachings were built on conflict and conquest. Sith Lords trained their students to dominate opponents, crush enemies, and rise through the violent ladder of power. Curiosity had little value in such a world. But Belia Darzu was not like the others. While other acolytes fought constantly for recognition, Darzu spent long hours studying ancient Sith records, old texts that many students avoided because they were dense, complicated, and sometimes dangerous to read. She was drawn to the oldest teachings, the forgotten ones, records left behind by Sith who had lived centuries before her birth. Many of those writings described something known only in whispers: Sith alchemy. To the Sith, alchemy was the art of transformation. Through dark rituals and the manipulation of the Force, ancient Sith Lords had twisted life itself into monstrous forms. They had created creatures known as Sith spawn, beasts that served as weapons of war during the earliest conflicts between Jedi and Sith. Most modern Sith considered these experiments crude. The creatures were powerful but unstable, too unpredictable, too difficult to control. But when Belia Darzu studied these records, she saw something different. She saw a beginning, because the Sith alchemists of the past had only altered flesh. They had never fully explored the connection between life and machine. And that was the thought that refused to leave her mind. If the dark side could reshape living matter, then perhaps life itself was not fixed. Perhaps it could be redesigned, not corrupted, not twisted, but rebuilt. At first, these ideas existed only as quiet theories in Darzu's thoughts. She did not speak about them openly. Within the Sith Order, knowledge was dangerous. The wrong discovery could attract the attention of masters who saw curiosity as a threat. So Belia Darzu remained silent. She watched. She studied. She waited. Years passed, and the galaxy around her continued to burn. The Sith Empire fought endless wars against the Galactic Republic and the Jedi Order. Entire star systems were consumed by conflict. But Belia Darzu's interest was never the battlefield. Her war would be fought somewhere else, inside laboratories, inside ancient Sith archives, inside the fragile boundary between life and something far more unnatural. And slowly, without anyone truly noticing, Belia Darzu began walking a path that no Sith before her had ever dared to follow. A path that would eventually force the Sith themselves to unite against her. Because the moment Belia Darzu proved her theories were possible, the galaxy would face something it had never seen before. An army born not from war, but from the dark side's power to change life itself. Belia Darzu learned very early that the galaxy did not trust creatures like her. Among the Shi'ido, the ability to change one's shape was natural. It was simply part of their biology. With enough concentration, a Shi'ido could alter their body, reshape their features, and appear as something entirely different. To her own people, this ability was ordinary. To everyone else, it was deeply unsettling. A being who could wear another face could never be fully trusted. And within the Sith Order, where suspicion and betrayal were already common, this truth followed Darzu everywhere she went. The academies of the Sith were not places of friendship. They were places of ambition. Acolytes competed constantly for the attention of their masters. Strength was respected. Cruelty was often rewarded. Weakness was quickly punished. But Belia Darzu did not behave the way the others expected. She rarely sought confrontation. She did not chase recognition. While other students fought to prove their dominance with lightsabers and displays of raw force power, Darzu watched quietly from the edges of the training halls. Some believed this meant she was weak. Others believed she was hiding something. The truth was far stranger. Darzu simply saw the Sith differently than most of her peers. To many acolytes, the Sith path was simple. The dark side gave them strength. That strength allowed them to rise above others. Power was the goal. But Belia Darzu was not interested in power for its own sake. She wanted understanding. In the quiet hours between training cycles, she spent long periods inside the deeper libraries of the academy. The Sith archives were vast, filled with records written across centuries of war and conquest. Many students avoided these places. The texts were old, difficult, often written in forgotten Sith dialects that required patience to translate. Darzu found them fascinating, because hidden within those records were fragments of ideas that most Sith had abandoned long ago. One subject appeared again and again across those ancient writings: alchemy. Not the simple corruption rituals taught to modern Sith apprentices. These were older teachings, more complex. They spoke of Sith Lords who had experimented with the Force in ways that blurred the line between science and sorcery. These Sith had not been satisfied with destroying their enemies. They had tried to reshape life itself. Through dark rituals and powerful manipulation of the Force, they had created creatures known as Sith-spawn, massive beasts twisted into weapons of war, creatures that obeyed the will of their masters completely. But as Darzu studied those records more carefully, she noticed something unusual. Nearly every ancient alchemist had reached the same limitation. They could corrupt life, they could twist flesh, but they could never achieve complete control. Sith-spawn were powerful, but unstable. The creatures often turned on their creators. Some escaped into the wild. Others simply collapsed beneath the strain of the unnatural transformations forced upon them. To most Sith scholars, these failures proved something important. Life resisted control. The Force could bend it, it could corrupt it, but it could never fully redesign it. Most Sith accepted that conclusion. Belia Darzu did not, because she had grown up with a different perspective on life itself. As a Shi'ido, her entire existence had already defied the idea that biology was fixed. Her people could reshape their own bodies through will and concentration. Their forms were flexible. Change was part of their nature. And when Darzu compared that truth with the failures of ancient Sith alchemy, she began to see the problem clearly. The Sith had been trying to dominate life through force alone. They had never truly understood its structure. And even more importantly, they had ignored another element of the galaxy that might complete the equation: technology. Across the galaxy, machines already performed countless tasks that organic life could not. They processed information, enhanced physical strength, and operated with perfect precision. But machines lacked something essential. The Force did not flow through them the way it flowed through living beings. Most Sith saw this as a limitation. Darzu saw it as an opportunity. If life could be shaped by the Force, and machines could be shaped by technology, then perhaps the two could be combined. Not merely connected, but merged. It was a dangerous idea, one that no Sith master had ever successfully attempted. But once the thought appeared in Darzu's mind, it refused to leave. And slowly, quietly, Belia Darzu began studying a second field of Sith knowledge that few others fully understood, a rare discipline known as Mechu Deru, the Sith art of bending machines through the power of the Force. Most Sith used it only to control droids or manipulate technology during battle. Darzu saw something far more important: a bridge, a way to bring life and machine together through the dark side. At that moment, Belia Darzu was still only a student within the Sith Order. No one feared her yet. No one believed she was dangerous. But the ideas forming inside her mind were already moving far beyond anything the Sith had attempted before. And once Belia Darzu began experimenting with those ideas, the Sith themselves would eventually wish she had never existed. The idea began as a quiet curiosity. At first, Belia Darzu treated it the way a scholar might approach any difficult problem. She gathered fragments of knowledge, studied forgotten texts, and slowly pieced together the theories left behind by earlier Sith alchemists. Most of those ancient writings ended in failure. Entire experiments had collapsed into disaster. Some Sith spawn had turned on their creators. Others had simply died moments after being created, their bodies unable to survive the unnatural changes forced upon them. But failure did not discourage Darzu. It fascinated her, because every failed experiment revealed something important about the limits of life itself. Over time, the patterns became clearer. The Sith of the past had always relied on domination. They forced their will upon living matter through raw dark side power, twisting flesh into new forms through violence and ritual. But Belia Darzu began to suspect that this approach was flawed from the beginning. Life resisted domination. Even corrupted life still followed its own biological structure. The Force could push against that structure, but it could not completely replace it. That was why Sith spawn remained unstable. They were creations built on force alone. But what if the problem was not the dark side? What if the problem was biology itself? That thought changed everything. If organic life had limits, then perhaps those limits could be removed. Technology did not suffer from the same weaknesses as living tissue. Machines did not decay the same way flesh did. They did not rebel against their own structure. They simply followed their design. And if the Force could influence both life and machines, then perhaps the true power of the dark side was not corruption. Perhaps it was reconstruction. Belia Darzu did not share these theories with anyone. Within the Sith Order, knowledge was never safe. Masters guarded their secrets carefully, and ambitious apprentices constantly searched for weaknesses in their rivals. To speak openly about such radical ideas would only attract attention, so Darzu continued her research in silence. During her training years, she gained access to deeper sections of the Sith archives, places where ancient records were preserved but rarely studied. Some of the texts were centuries old, written during earlier eras of Sith dominance. These records described strange Force disciplines that had almost disappeared from modern Sith teachings. Among them was the art Darzu had already begun studying, Mechu Deru, the ability to manipulate machines through the dark side. Most Sith considered the discipline a minor skill. It allowed a Force user to influence mechanical systems, disrupt droids, or bend technology to their will during combat. Useful, but not revolutionary. Darzu saw it differently. When she practiced Mechu Deru, she noticed something unusual. The Force did not flow through machines the way it flowed through living beings, but it could still touch them. Through concentration, she could sense the delicate pathways inside a machine, circuits, processors, energy conduits. She could feel how those systems reacted to the dark side when she applied pressure through the Force. The connection was faint, but it was real. And if the Force could influence machines, then perhaps machines could become part of something greater. Slowly, Darzu began experimenting with small mechanical components while focusing through the dark side. At first, the results were simple. Devices responding to her commands, machines moving without physical input. But over time, the experiments grew more complex. She began studying how technology interacted with organic life, medical implants, cybernetic replacements, artificial limbs used by soldiers injured during war. Across the galaxy, technology already merged with living bodies in limited ways. But those connections were crude, temporary. The living host remained dominant. Belia Darzu wondered what would happen if the balance were reversed, if machine and life were not simply attached, but fused together completely. At this point, her research had moved far beyond the teachings of the Sith Academy. She was no longer just studying history. She was beginning to imagine something entirely new. And with every passing year, the curiosity that had once driven her quiet research slowly transformed into something much stronger, something deeper, obsession. Because Belia Darzu was beginning to believe that the dark side of the Force held a secret the Sith had never truly understood. The power to create life that did not exist before, not born naturally, not corrupted from existing creatures, but designed, built, engineered through the union of dark side power and technology. If such a thing were possible, it would change the nature of war itself. Armies that never tired, creatures that never questioned their masters, life forms designed entirely for obedience. The Sith had spent centuries searching for ultimate power. Belia Darzu was beginning to suspect she had found the path toward it. But the deeper she traveled into this research, the more dangerous her ideas became. Because the moment those theories turned into real experiments, Belia Darzu would step onto a path that even the Sith themselves would eventually fear. And once that path began, there would be no turning back. Curiosity had carried Belia Darzu further than most Sith apprentices ever traveled. But curiosity alone was never enough to change the galaxy. To do that, she would need knowledge the Sith Order had long buried. The deeper archives of the Sith academies held many things: records of ancient wars, forgotten rituals, and teachings passed down from masters who had ruled centuries before. Most acolytes only studied what their instructors allowed. Belia Darzu studied everything else. She spent long nights reading texts that few others had the patience to understand. Some were written in archaic Sith languages that had not been spoken in generations. Others described experiments so dangerous that even the Sith had eventually forbidden them. Among those records were the last surviving notes of ancient Sith alchemists. Many of these figures had lived during earlier ages of Sith dominance, when the dark side was studied with a kind of reckless ambition that later Sith Lords would come to fear. They had conducted rituals that twisted living creatures into monstrous forms. They had corrupted entire ecosystems through the Force. Their creations had once marched beside Sith armies during the earliest Jedi-Sith conflicts. But over time, the Sith Order had slowly abandoned those practices. The creatures created through Sith alchemy were powerful, yet unstable. Many experiments ended in disaster. Entire laboratories had been destroyed when the beings created within them turned on their masters. Eventually, most Sith concluded that the risks were too great. The research was sealed away, forgotten. But Belia Darzu did not see those records as warnings. She saw them as unfinished work. As she studied the failures of past alchemists, a pattern continued to emerge. Every one of those Sith had relied on the same method, overwhelming living matter with raw, dark side energy. They forced change. They demanded obedience from flesh itself, and flesh resisted. But Darzu had already begun to see the flaw in that approach. Organic life was fragile. Its structure limited what the dark side could accomplish. No matter how powerful the ritual, living biology would always push back against transformation. Machines did not. Technology followed design, not instinct. It obeyed structure perfectly. And the moment that realization fully settled in Darzu's mind, the path before her finally became clear. Sith alchemy had never truly failed. It had simply been incomplete. The Sith of the past had tried to control life through the Force alone. Belia Darzu would use something more. The union of dark side power and machine precision. Once the idea fully formed, her research accelerated. Darzu began studying mechanical engineering alongside ancient Sith rituals. She observed how cybernetic implants interacted with the nervous systems of living beings. She examined the ways in which machines could enhance physical strength, perception, and durability. Across the galaxy, countless beings already lived with mechanical components replacing damaged limbs or organs. But those augmentations were limited, temporary. They never truly changed the nature of the living host. Belia Darzu began imagining something else entirely. Not implants, not assistants, transformation. Creatures that were both organic and mechanical at the deepest level. Life that did not simply carry machines, but depended on them. And through the dark side, those creatures could be bound completely to the will of their creator. At this stage, her theories still existed only in private notes and quiet experiments, but they were growing more detailed with every passing year. Darzu knew the Sith Order would never approve of such research if it became known. Even among Sith, there were limits to what masters would tolerate from ambitious students. Experiments that threatened the stability of the Order itself could not be allowed. So Belia Darzu continued her work in absolute secrecy. She learned to hide her notes, to erase records of her studies, to ensure that no master or rival apprentice could fully understand what she was developing. To the outside world, she remained simply another Sith scholar, quiet, disciplined, and largely ignored by those who preferred the glory of battle. But behind that calm exterior, something far more dangerous was taking shape. The theories that had begun as curiosity were slowly evolving into something real, something that could eventually leave the realm of thought and enter the physical galaxy. Belia Darzu had not yet created anything. No experiments had crossed the final boundary between theory and life, but the foundation had already been built. She now understood the principles, she understood the tools, and most importantly, she understood the dark side well enough to attempt what no Sith before her had ever accomplished. Soon, knowledge alone would no longer satisfy her. Soon, Belia Darzu would need a place where she could finally test her ideas without interference. A place hidden from the eyes of the Sith Order. A place where curiosity could finally become creation. And once that moment arrived, the galaxy would begin to learn the true meaning of the name Belia Darzu. The Sith academies of that era were not quiet places. They were loud with ambition. Every corridor carried the sound of conflict. Training halls echoed with the clash of lightsabers. Young acolytes tested their strength against one another constantly, each of them hoping to rise above the rest. In the Sith Order, survival depended on power, and power was proven through domination. Many apprentices believed that if they could fight harder, strike faster, and command the dark side with greater rage than their rivals, they would eventually earn the attention of the Sith Lords who ruled above them. But Belia Darzu did not follow that path. While other acolytes rushed toward combat training, Darzu often remained silent at the edges of the academy halls. She watched the struggles around her with a calm patience that others found unsettling. Because she rarely competed, she rarely fought, and when she did, she never seemed interested in victory itself. The Sith instructors noticed this quickly. In the early years of her training, several masters attempted to push Darzu into the same mold as the other apprentices. They tested her through duels, forced her into brutal trials, and demanded the same hunger for dominance that defined most Sith students. But the results were always the same. Darzu obeyed the instructions. She learned the techniques, yet her attention never remained on combat for long. Her mind moved elsewhere, to questions. Questions the Sith academies were not designed to answer. During one training cycle, a Sith instructor once asked a group of apprentices a simple question. What is the purpose of the dark side? The answers came quickly. To gain power, to dominate the weak, to conquer the galaxy. The instructor approved of these responses. They reflected the teachings passed down through generations of Sith philosophy. When it was Belia Darzu's turn to speak, she hesitated. Her answer was quiet. The dark side changes things. The instructor frowned. That was not the answer he expected. Power, domination, victory. Those were the truths the Sith valued. But change was not something the Sith usually discussed. Yet Darzu did not explain herself further. She simply returned to silence, allowing the instructor to move on to the next student. But the thought remained with her long after the lesson ended. Because in Darzu's mind, the dark side had always felt different from the way the Sith described it. Most Sith believed the Force existed to be controlled. They bent it through anger and willpower until it obeyed their commands. But Belia Darzu felt the dark side moving through the galaxy in more complex ways. It flowed through living beings. It shaped emotions. It influenced growth, decay, transformation. The more she studied the Force, the more she realized something important. The Sith had always focused on what the dark side could destroy. Very few had studied what it could create. This thought drew her deeper into the archives of Sith knowledge. By the time Darzu reached the later stages of her apprenticeship, She had gained limited access to restricted sections of the Academy libraries, places where records from older Sith eras were preserved. And many of these texts were considered dangerous. Some described experiments that had ended in catastrophe. Others recorded teachings from Sith Lords, whose methods were later condemned by the Order itself. Most apprentices never opened those records. Belia Darzu studied them carefully. Among those forgotten teachings, one subject appeared again and again: Sith alchemy. Ancient Sith alchemists had once believed the dark side could reshape life itself. Through ritual, sacrifice, and powerful manipulation of the Force, they had twisted living creatures into monstrous servants. Some of these beings had been used during the earliest wars against the Jedi. But those experiments had eventually stopped. The creatures were unstable, difficult to control, too dangerous to reproduce reliably. Over time, Sith leaders began discouraging further research in the field. War demanded soldiers who obeyed orders, not monsters that might turn on their masters. For most Sith apprentices, that history served as a warning. For Belia Darzu, it became something else entirely, a challenge. Because when she examined the failures of past alchemists, she noticed the same mistake repeated again and again. The Sith had relied only on the Force. They had tried to reshape life through dark side rituals alone. But Belia Darzu had already begun studying another discipline that few Sith fully understood: Mechu Deru, the power to influence machines through the Force. And slowly, as these two ideas began to merge inside her mind, Darzu realized something that no Sith instructor had ever taught. The dark side did not only destroy, it could also design. Life could be altered, life could be rebuilt, but the Sith had never discovered the correct method. Not yet. And as Belia Darzu continued her quiet studies, the thought slowly took hold inside her mind. Perhaps the reason the Sith had never succeeded was because the one who would solve the problem had not yet been born. Belia Darzu's teachers believed they understood what made a Sith strong. They taught that strength came from anger, sharpened into purpose, from ambition, hardened into cruelty, from the will to dominate anyone too weak to resist. In their eyes, the Sith were not meant to question the path. They were meant to walk it. That was how the Order survived through war after war. Every lesson was built around the same harsh truth. Power belonged to those who could seize it and hold it without mercy. But Belia Darzu kept noticing what the Sith left out. They spoke constantly about conquest, but very little about understanding. They taught students how to break enemies, but not how to study the deeper structure of the Force itself. They preserved rituals, but often without asking why those rituals had first been created. Ancient knowledge was repeated as doctrine, stripped of the dangerous curiosity that had once given birth to it. To most apprentices, this did not matter. The Sith were already powerful. The Jedi were their enemy. The Republic was something to be crushed. That was enough. It was never enough for Darzu. As her apprenticeship continued, she became more disciplined, more precise, and even more difficult for others to read. Her Shiido nature had already made the people around her uneasy. Her silence only made that feeling worse. Other acolytes often mistook silence for weakness. That mistake rarely lasted. Belia Darzu was not the fiercest duelist in the academy, but she understood timing. She understood how long most people could hide their impatience before it betrayed them. In sparring circles and controlled trials, she learned to let others waste themselves first. They struck harder. She watched longer. They burned with emotion. She endured it. And when the moment came, she moved with cold precision rather than rage. It was not the style the Sith admired most, but it kept teaching her the same lesson. Raw force was not always superior to control. That lesson followed her beyond the training halls. In the hidden corners of the Academy archives, Darzu found records that many Sith instructors seemed almost embarrassed to preserve. Some scrolls and data fragments dated back to earlier generations of Sith experimentation. They described rituals, biological corruption, and failed attempts to create obedient war beasts through alchemy. Again and again, Darzu found the same result. Power without precision led to ruin. The old Sith had possessed enormous strength, but their creations had often been unstable because the work itself was violent and incomplete. Flesh was forced into new shapes, but never truly understood. Creatures were twisted, but not perfected. Most readers would have taken this as proof that such research should remain buried. Belia Darzu read it as proof that the Sith had abandoned the work too early. The more she studied, the more she began to separate herself from the beliefs of the Order around her. Not openly, not foolishly. She did not challenge masters in public or speak against Sith teachings before the other apprentices. She was far too careful for that. But inwardly, something was changing. She had begun her training as a student inside the Sith system. Now she was slowly becoming an observer of its limits. That was a dangerous thing for any Sith to become, because once a Sith stops believing that the Order possesses the final answer, the Order itself begins to look small. Darzu saw warriors obsessed with battle, masters obsessed with rank, and rivals obsessed with each other. They fought for favor, titles, and survival in a system that consumed nearly all of their attention. Meanwhile, the oldest mysteries of the dark side remained almost untouched. In that silence, Belia Darzu found her purpose. She turned again toward the disciplines the Sith treated as secondary. Ancient alchemy, Mechu Deru, records of Sith spawn, accounts of organic corruption and mechanical control. She did not study them as separate subjects anymore. In her mind, they were beginning to converge into one unfinished truth. The Force could bend life. The Force could touch machines. So why had the Sith accepted a universe in which those two powers remained divided? That question did not leave her. It followed her into meditation, into the archives, into every quiet hour when the Academy finally fell silent, and the fires of ambition burned lower in the halls. Other apprentices slept, planned betrayals, or dreamed of battlefield glory. Belia Darzu studied structure. She studied living tissue, decay, mutation, cybernetic function, and the old records of beings altered by the dark side. Bit by bit, a new belief began taking shape inside her. The Sith had misunderstood creation because they had approached it like conquerors. Darzu would approach it like an architect. And once that belief settled fully into her mind, the next step became unavoidable. Studying ancient alchemy was no longer enough. Sooner or later, Belia Darzu would have to test whether the forbidden lessons the Sith had ignored could become something real. Knowledge, on its own, could only carry Belia Darzu so far. For many years she had studied the failures of the past. She had examined the ancient records of Sith alchemists, the rituals they performed, the creatures they created, and the reasons those creations eventually collapsed. But there was a moment when studying history was no longer enough. Sooner or later, a Sith had to test the truth for themselves. For Belia Darzu, that moment arrived quietly. There was no dramatic decision, no declaration of defiance against the Sith Order. Nothing about the beginning of her experiments appeared significant from the outside. She simply began asking different questions questions about the structure of life itself. The Sith academies possess small laboratories used for studying biological samples and the effects of dark side energy on living organisms. These spaces were rarely used for anything ambitious. Most instructors focused their attention on combat training and the political survival of their students. That neglect created an opportunity. Darzu began conducting small experiments during the quiet hours when the laboratories stood empty. She worked slowly, carefully, always ensuring that no one else noticed how often she returned. At first, the work was simple. She observed how living tissue reacted to concentrated dark side energy. Some organic material decayed rapidly under its influence. Other samples showed signs of mutation, small changes in structure that revealed how flexible biological systems could become when exposed to the Force. Ancient Sith alchemists had already documented much of this, but Darzu was not repeating their work. She was searching for the precise moment when corruption could become transformation. And slowly, she began introducing something the old Sith had rarely used during their alchemical rituals: technology. Small mechanical components were placed alongside organic samples. Sensors monitored changes in tissue structure, while Darzu focused through the dark side. Circuits responded faintly to her influence through Mechu Deru, creating a strange balance between living matter and machine control. The early results were unstable. Living tissue often rejected the mechanical presence. The organic structures attempted to isolate or destroy the artificial material. But failure did not discourage Darzu. Failure was information. Every collapse revealed another boundary between life and machine, another clue about where the connection between them could begin. Over time, she noticed something remarkable. When mechanical structures were introduced slowly, carefully integrated rather than forced, the living samples sometimes adapted. The biological systems attempted to grow around the artificial components rather than reject them. The Force responded to these changes. Dark side energy flowed through the living tissue and brushed against the machines at the same time. For the first time, Darzu sensed something she had never felt before: a connection, faint, unstable, but real. It was the first proof that her theories might be possible. She was still far from creating anything resembling a living creature. The experiments remained microscopic in scale, involving only fragments of tissue and basic mechanical systems. But the implications were enormous. If life could adapt to machine integration under the influence of the dark side, then the Sith had been looking at alchemy the wrong way for centuries. They had tried to twist creatures into monstrous forms. Belia Darzu was beginning to realize that the dark side could do something far more powerful. It could guide evolution itself. From that point forward, her work changed. The quiet curiosity that had once defined her studies began to harden into something deeper. She started documenting her results with careful precision, building theories that connected biology, technology, and dark side manipulation into a single discipline. It was no longer simply Sith alchemy. It was something new, something that had never truly existed before. But this new direction carried risks Darzu understood very well. If the Sith Masters discovered what she was doing, they would almost certainly shut it down. Not because they doubted the power of the dark side, but because they feared anything that could destabilize the order itself. Experiments that altered life were dangerous. Experiments that could create entirely new forms of life were far worse. So Belia Darzu continued her work in silence. No apprentices assisted her. No masters supervised her. Every experiment, every discovery, every failure belonged to her alone. And as the results slowly improved, one thought began to grow stronger in her mind. The Sith academies were no longer the right place for this work. The experiments were becoming too complex, too ambitious. Soon, Belia Darzu would need something else. A place far from the watchful eyes of the Sith. A place where the next stage of her research could finally begin. The first experiments did not frighten Belia Darzu. If anything, they confirmed what she had suspected for years. The Sith had misunderstood the dark side. They treated it like a weapon, something to be unleashed through anger and domination. In battle, that belief worked well enough. The Sith crushed their enemies, conquered worlds, and expanded their influence through fear. But the deeper Darzu traveled into her research, the clearer something became. The dark side was not only destructive, it was creative. Not in the way the Jedi described life, with balance and harmony, guiding the galaxy toward growth. The dark side created through pressure, through transformation, through the breaking of old limits. The ancient alchemists had already glimpsed that truth when they created the first Sith spawn, but they had stopped too soon. Their work had been violent and impatient. They forced change upon living creatures without fully understanding the structure they were trying to reshape. Belia Darzu would not make that mistake. She approached the work with a patience that most Sith found difficult to understand. Every experiment was recorded, every failure analyzed, every slight improvement studied, until she understood why it had occurred. The laboratory had become her true training ground. Other apprentices still believed the path to greatness lay in combat halls and political games between masters and students. Rivalries grew sharper as Sith instructors evaluated who among them might rise and who would fall. Darzu ignored all of it. She still attended the required trials. She still practiced the teachings expected of her. But the competitions that obsessed her fellow acolytes had begun to feel distant and irrelevant, because in her mind she had already moved beyond them. The Sith fought endless wars across the galaxy, seeking power through conquest. They believed victory would bring them control. Belia Darzu was beginning to understand something far more dangerous. True control did not come from ruling the galaxy. It came from reshaping the rules that governed it. If life itself could be redesigned, then armies, politics, and territory would become secondary concerns. A being who controlled creation itself would no longer need to fight wars in the traditional sense. They would simply build forces that could never be defeated. This belief grew slowly, but once it settled inside Darzu's mind, it began to change how she saw everything around her. The Sith Order suddenly felt limited, short-sighted. Its leaders focused on domination through strength, but they rarely invested time in understanding the deeper mechanics of the Force itself. An ancient knowledge remained locked away in archives, because masters feared what ambitious students might discover. In that sense, the Sith had begun to resemble the Jedi more than they realized. Both orders feared what they did not fully understand. But Belia Darzu no longer shared that fear. Her experiments had already proven something important. Life could adapt. Life could merge with machine structure under the influence of the dark side. The process was fragile, the connection unstable, yet the boundary had already been crossed. And once a boundary like that is crossed even once, it can be crossed again. Darzu now understood the path ahead of her. The laboratories within the academy had allowed her to test small theories. They had helped her prove that the dark side could influence both organic life and mechanical systems at the same time. But the next stage of her work would be far more dangerous. Larger organisms, complex integration between living tissue and advanced machinery. Experiments that would require time, space, and secrecy far beyond what the Academy could offer. If anyone discovered the full extent of her research, the Sith Masters would intervene immediately, not because they doubted the power of her work, but because they would fear it, and fear always produced the same reaction among the Sith: destruction. Belia Darzu understood this well, so she began preparing for the moment when she would leave the Academy behind. Not as a failed apprentice, not as a defeated rival, but as something else entirely. She was a Sith who had already discovered a path the Order itself had never truly walked. The galaxy beyond the Academy walls was vast. Entire worlds existed beyond the attention of Sith politics and Jedi conflict, places where knowledge could grow in silence. Darzu began studying star charts, ancient Sith territories, and forgotten planets that once held significance during earlier ages of the Order. Somewhere in that darkness, she would find the place she needed, a hidden sanctuary where theory could finally become creation. And once Belia Darzu left the Academy behind, the quiet experiments that had begun in secrecy would grow into something far larger, something the Sith themselves would one day struggle to control. By the time Belia Darzu left behind the narrow limits of the Academy, her mind had already gone somewhere the Sith around her could not follow. She no longer wanted lessons, she wanted access, not to power in the way other Sith craved it, not rank, not titles, not the temporary satisfaction of defeating rivals in training halls that smelled of ash and old blood. She wanted the oldest knowledge still hidden beneath the Sith Order itself, and that search eventually drew her toward Korriban. For the Sith, Korriban was more than a world. It was memory-made stone, a planet of tombs, dust, and silence, where ancient Dark Lords had been buried beneath the red earth for centuries. The winds that moved across its valleys felt as though they carried voices with them. Every structure seemed older than war itself. Every corridor felt watched. To most Sith, Korriban was sacred because it held the dead. To Belia Darzu, it was sacred because the dead had taken their secrets with them. That was where the true work waited. The outer temples and training grounds revealed only a small part of what Korriban held. Beneath the visible ruins, deeper chambers remained sealed behind ritual locks, forgotten pathways, and archives guarded more by fear than by soldiers. The Sith preserved those places, but they did not share them freely. Knowledge on Korriban was never truly public. It was layered, hidden, reserved for those with rank, patience, or the willingness to trespass where they were not meant to go. Belia Darzu had patience, and she had already learned that the Sith often buried what frightened them most. The descent into those lower archives felt less like study and more like intrusion. The air grew colder the deeper she traveled. Ancient walls narrowed around her. Stone corridors twisted into chambers lit only by weak lamps and the red glow of old inscriptions. Dust-covered sealed containers, broken tablets, and records so old that some had survived only because no one had dared destroy them completely. This was not the knowledge taught to apprentices. This was what remained after centuries of Sith regret. Darzu moved through those chambers slowly, reading wherever she could, translating whatever she found. Some records were fragmented. Some contradicted one another. Others had been deliberately damaged, as though later Sith had tried to erase the ideas without fully succeeding. That, more than anything, held her attention. When knowledge is hidden, it usually means someone still fears it. And here on Korriban, fear lingered everywhere. The texts she uncovered spoke in pieces about early Sith alchemists, beings who had gone far beyond the rituals preserved in modern teachings. These were not simple notes on corruption or the creation of crude Sith spawn. They were deeper than that, more methodical, more dangerous. They described flesh as structure, bone as framework, nerve and blood as systems that could be altered rather than merely wounded. To another reader, the language might have felt monstrous. To Belia Darzu, it felt precise. The more she read, the more a terrible truth began to take shape. The Sith of earlier ages had come closer to true transformation than modern Sith realized. They had not failed because the dark side lacked the power. They had failed because the work demanded a discipline most Sith did not possess. It required patience, observation, repetition, and a willingness to treat life not as something sacred, but as something editable. That word settled deeply into Darzu's mind. Editable. On Korriban, surrounded by tombs and buried records, Belia Darzu felt closer than ever to the thing she had sensed since childhood. That incomplete pattern within the Force. That quiet suggestion that life and dark side power were connected by laws the Sith had only partly understood. Here, at last, she was finding the missing pieces. And with every passage she uncovered, one certainty grew stronger. The Sith had not abandoned these teachings because they were useless. They had abandoned them because they had seen what might happen if someone finally succeeded. Belia Darzu kept reading. And somewhere in the depths beneath Korriban, hidden among the records of the dead, the path ahead of her began to open. The deeper Belia Darzu moved into the archives beneath Korriban, the less those chambers felt like a library. They felt like a grave, not because of the dust or the silence or the tombs that surrounded them on every side, but because nearly every text she found carried the same feeling. Something had been left there to die. The Sith had not simply stored this knowledge away. They had buried it. Some scrolls were sealed inside cracked containers, marked with warnings in ancient Sith script. Others existed only as broken tablets or damaged records, their missing lines suggesting deliberate destruction rather than the slow damage of time. Whole passages had been burned away. Names had been removed. Ritual steps had been scattered across separate texts, as though later Sith had tried to make the knowledge unusable without fully erasing it. But Belia Darzu was patient, and patience could restore what fear had tried to destroy. She began comparing fragments, matching symbols and repeated phrases across different records. What one tablet left incomplete, another hinted at more clearly. Ritual formulas appeared beside anatomical notes. Descriptions of alchemical fire sat beside observations of bone growth, tissue instability, and the effects of prolonged dark side exposure on living organisms. This was not myth. That was the first thing Darzu understood. Modern Sith often treated ancient alchemy as something half-legendary, spoken of in the same tone as cursed tombs and ghost-filled ruins. Even when the Order acknowledged its past experiments, it reduced them to cautionary tales. But the writings below Korriban did not read like legends. They read like research, cold, detailed, repetitive. The work of Sith who had not been chasing symbolism or spectacle, but results. Some of those results were horrifying. One record described the reshaping of predators into war beasts designed to obey specific Force commands. Another spoke of bone reinforcement through ritual exposure to dark side energy, though the subject died after only a short period of survival. Several texts described failed attempts to bind rage directly into living tissue, producing creatures of enormous aggression but little stability. Again and again, the same word appeared in different forms. Instability. It haunted the archive like a warning. The old alchemists had learned how to force change upon life, but not how to preserve it. Their creations were powerful, sometimes devastatingly so, yet they often broke apart under their own unnatural design. Flesh mutated, but did not endure. Bodies obeyed for a time, then failed. Minds shattered. Organs collapsed. Entire experiments turned to ruin because the living structures could not carry the weight of what had been forced into them. To many Sith, that would have been enough reason to stop reading. To Belia Darzu, it only sharpened the question. What was missing? She did not believe the problem lay with the dark side itself. The power described in the texts was real, and the results proved that transformation was possible. Life could be rewritten, at least in part. So why did it always collapse? Slowly, her answer returned to the same place it always had. Because the Sith had insisted on working with flesh alone. The more Darzu studied these records, the more certain she became that the old alchemists had come to the edge of a truth they could not cross. They had learned how to alter biological systems, but they remained trapped by the weakness of organic life. Living tissue resisted perfect control. It decayed. It rebelled. It could be shaped, but not fully stabilized through ritual alone. Machines did not suffer from those same weaknesses. That thought moved through her mind like a quiet flame, and suddenly the records below Korriban no longer felt incomplete. They felt interrupted, as though ancient Sith alchemy had not failed at all, as though it had merely been abandoned before its next stage could begin. Darzu kept digging through the buried words of dead Sith, and in their unfinished work she began to see her own reflection. Not because she was like them in temperament. Many had been reckless, impatient, almost drunk on the power they wielded. She was different. She would do what they could not. She would take their work apart, piece by piece, and rebuild it with discipline. Not as a ritualist chasing monsters, not as a warlord seeking crude weapons, but as something colder, something more exact. By the time Belia Darzu rose from those lower archives, carrying copied fragments and forbidden notes hidden among her possessions, she understood that Korriban had given her more than knowledge. It had given her permission. The Sith had buried these texts because they feared what they might lead to. Belia Darzu intended to find out. With the forbidden records of Korriban now hidden among her private notes, Belia Darzu no longer approached alchemy as a student reading the failures of others. She approached it as a problem waiting to be solved. The texts she had gathered were incomplete, but they revealed enough. Ancient alchemists had learned how to force change into living flesh through the dark side. They had bent muscle, bone, and instinct into new forms. They had created servants that were stronger, crueler, and more obedient than nature had intended. But the same weakness haunted nearly every experiment. The body could be changed. It could not endure. That was the line Belia Darzu now meant to cross. She began her next work in greater secrecy than ever before. The archives beneath Korriban had given her knowledge, but not safety. Even on the Sith tomb world, there were limits to what could be studied openly. Too much interest in the buried disciplines of ancient alchemy could still attract the attention of masters who preferred dangerous knowledge to remain buried. So Darzu moved carefully. She found quiet places away from the main halls and ritual paths. Storage chambers, disused study cells, small laboratory spaces overlooked by those who believed the real business of the Sith still happened in war rooms and training arenas. There, she began testing the old alchemical principles on living material again. At first, the work remained controlled. Tissue samples, small organisms, creatures with simple biological structures that allowed her to observe change without drawing notice. She applied the methods preserved in the Korriban records with more patience than their original authors had ever shown. She reduced the violence of the rituals. She altered the sequencing. She observed not only what changed, but how long those changes remained stable. The early outcomes were familiar. Flesh responded to the dark side. It thickened, hardened, mutated. Growth accelerated in some samples. In others, internal systems destabilized almost immediately. Muscle expanded beyond what bone could support. New tissue formed too quickly and collapsed. Nervous responses intensified, then spiraled into useless spasms. The old Sith had seen these same results. Belia Darzu was seeing them more clearly, and with each experiment, her conviction only deepened. The problem was not transformation. The problem was structure. The living bodies were too delicate to hold the full weight of what the dark side could force into them. They could be altered, but not perfected by ritual alone. The old alchemists had treated this instability as a curse attached to their art. Darzu began to treat it as an engineering flaw. That single change in perspective transformed everything. She no longer looked at flesh as something mysterious or sacred. She looked at it as a system, a network of functions. Bone supported mass. Muscle created motion. Nerves carried command. Organs sustained energy. If one part failed, the whole body failed with it. And if one part was too weak, it could be replaced. That was where the old Sith had stopped. Belia Darzu did not. Using the principles of Mechu Deru alongside the alchemical methods she had recovered from Korriban, she began testing the relationship between living tissue and inserted mechanical support. Not crude cybernetics in the common sense, not replacement limbs or armor attachments. Something deeper, something integrated. She introduced minute artificial structures into living samples while guiding the interaction through the Force. Tiny supports, controlled interfaces, mechanical reinforcement designed not to sit beside flesh, but to become part of its new design. The process remained unstable. Many samples failed immediately. Some living systems rejected the artificial material the moment change began. Others adapted for a short time, only to break down later. But then, in small and fleeting ways, a new result appeared. Certain structures held. Not perfectly, not for long, but long enough. Long enough for Darzu to see that the old boundary between flesh and machine was not absolute. Under enough pressure, with enough control, life could be made to grow around what was once foreign to it. That discovery did not bring her relief. It brought hunger. Because now the theory was no longer a theory. What she had sensed since childhood, what the archives of Korriban had hinted at, what the failures of ancient alchemy had almost revealed, was real. Life could be reshaped more completely than the Sith had ever understood. But Belia Darzu also knew something else now. She could not continue this work here forever. Korriban had given her buried knowledge. It had given her fragments, warnings, and half-finished methods. But the tomb world was still watched, still sacred, still too close to the order that would destroy her research if it grasped what she was truly building toward. Soon she would need distance, a place beyond masters, rivals, and sacred archives. A place where flesh, machine, and dark side ritual could meet without restraint. And once she found that place, Belia Darzu would stop studying transformation. She would begin creating it. By the time Belia Darzu reached the final stage of her work on Korriban, she understood something with cold certainty. The Sith Order would never accept what she was becoming. Not because her research lacked value, but because it carried a kind of power the Sith themselves could not fully control. For generations, the Sith had tolerated cruelty, betrayal, and conquest. They had built entire empires on fear. They had turned worlds into graves and trained children to see pain as discipline. But even within such an order, there were boundaries that remained unspoken. Belia Darzu was moving beyond them. The old texts buried beneath Korriban had shown her the first shape of that forbidden path. Her own experiments had confirmed what the ancient alchemists had failed to finish. Flesh could be altered. Life could be pushed toward new forms. And when guided through the dark side with enough precision, organic structure could begin to accept artificial design. That truth changed the scale of her ambition. She no longer thought only in terms of altered tissue or isolated transformation. Her mind had already moved towards something larger, entire organisms, living beings redesigned from within, servants that would not merely obey, but exist for obedience, forms built for endurance, violence, and loyalty at a level ordinary soldiers could never reach. The idea no longer felt impossible. It felt inevitable. And that was exactly what made it dangerous. Darzu continued her work in silence, but secrecy on Korriban was never permanent. The tomb world remembered too much. Too many eyes passed through its halls. Too many rival Sith watched for signs of weakness or ambition in those around them. Questions began to gather around her. Why did Belia Darzu spend so much time away from the training paths? Why did she seek forgotten records others avoided? Why had her interests drifted so far from the concerns of normal Sith advancement? No one yet understood the full truth, but suspicion was beginning to form. Darzu sensed it the way she sensed everything else, not through panic, but through pattern, a shifted glance, a silence where there should have been none, the subtle tightening of attention that always came before danger. She knew the order well enough by now. A Sith could be feared for power and still survive. They could be hated, envied, even openly challenged. But to become unreadable was different. That was when the order began to consider destruction. Because Belia Darzu no longer resembled the apprentices around her, or even the masters above them. She was not climbing the usual ladder. She was stepping sideways into knowledge the Sith had deliberately left behind. And buried knowledge always carries an accusation with it. If it was hidden, who gave you the right to uncover it? That question now followed her everywhere. The final experiments she conducted on Korriban were not large, but they were enough to convince her that she could not remain there any longer. The work required freedom, scale, and time. It required larger spaces, better control, and distance from the hands that might seize or destroy her notes before her methods were complete. Most of all, it required a place where failure would not be seen, because the next stage would not be clean. It would not be simple. It would demand trials the Sith would call heresy, even while secretly fearing that they might work. Belia Darzu gathered what she had learned from the tomb world with extraordinary care. Fragments of ancient alchemical records, notes on failed transformations, her own calculations, observations, and refinements. The buried words of dead Sith now lived inside her private work, but she no longer needed Korriban the way she once had. The tomb world had served its purpose. It had given her the past. Now she needed a future. So Belia Darzu prepared to leave the world of tombs and buried warnings behind. She would carry its knowledge into darkness, far from the order, far from sacred ruins and suspicious masters, far from anyone who still believed life must obey the limits nature gave it. And when she disappeared from Korriban, she did not leave as a student. She left as something far more dangerous. A Sith who had stopped asking whether forbidden knowledge should remain buried, and had begun asking what the galaxy would become once that knowledge was finally used. Korriban had given Belia Darzu knowledge, but knowledge was not enough. The tomb world of the Sith had shown her what earlier alchemists had attempted. It had revealed the failures they left behind, the rituals they buried, and the terrible pattern that had followed them all. Flesh could be changed. Life could be bent. But the old methods always collapsed under the weakness of organic form. Darzu now understood something the dead had only begun to see. If the Sith wanted creatures that could survive transformation, then flesh alone would never be enough. That truth could not be tested on Korriban. The planet was too sacred, too watched, too deeply tied to the old traditions of the Order. Every corridor held memory. Every chamber felt close to the eyes of masters who might never fully understand her work, but would destroy it the moment they sensed its scale. So Belia Darzu went somewhere the Sith were not looking. She went to Tython. To the Jedi, Tython had once been a birthplace, a world of ancient balance, old teachings, and beginnings that stretched back toward the earliest days of Force history. But by Darzu's era, it was something quieter, more distant, a place of ruins, secrets, and forgotten meaning. That was exactly why it mattered. Tython was far enough from the center of Sith power to offer silence, yet old enough to carry the weight of ancient Force tradition beneath its surface. Darzu did not choose it for symbolism. She chose it because it was hidden, remote, and useful. There she established a fortress, not a palace, not a monument to glory, a laboratory, a place built for patience, isolation, and control. The stronghold was hidden carefully, designed to protect both her research and her privacy. Within its walls, Darzu created the environment she had never possessed before: controlled chambers, secure vaults, workspaces where alchemical practice and technological study could exist side by side without the interruptions of Sith politics or the suspicions of rival apprentices. For the first time in her life, Belia Darzu was completely alone with her ideas, and alone they began to grow. The silence of Tython suited her. Away from the academies, the tombs, and the endless performance of Sith ambition, Darzu no longer needed to pretend she was pursuing the same goals as the Order around her. Here, there were no instructors to satisfy, no rivals to deceive, no rituals to perform for the sake of appearance. Only work, only the next step. Inside the fortress, she began assembling everything her research required: alchemical materials, medical equipment, mechanical systems, energy sources, containment areas for living subjects, records copied from Korriban, private notes built over years of study and hidden experimentation. All of it now came together in one place. And with that, Belia Darzu crossed a line she could never uncross. Up until this point, she had still been proving theories, testing boundaries. Now, for the first time, she was preparing to create something permanent. Tython became more than a hiding place. It became an extension of her own mind. Every chamber inside the fortress reflected a different part of the work she had spent years building toward. In one room, she studied the limits of biological adaptation. In another, she refined her use of Mechudaru, strengthening her ability to influence machinery through the dark side. In deeper chambers, she began setting aside space for something larger than tissue samples or minor structural tests. Soon, living beings would enter those rooms, and they would not leave unchanged. The old Sith had worked in fragments. Their rituals were powerful, but crude. Their monsters were terrifying, but unstable. Belia Darzu intended to bring discipline to the chaos. Her fortress on Tython would allow her to repeat experiments, compare results, and refine methods with the kind of cold patience earlier alchemists had never shown. That patience was what made her so dangerous. She did not want a single monstrous success. She wanted a system, a method by which life itself could be redesigned. And in the stillness of that hidden fortress, surrounded by machines, dark side knowledge, and the silence of a forgotten world, Belia Darzu finally stood at the beginning of her true work. The Sith Order did not yet know what she was building. The galaxy did not yet know what was waiting on Tython. But inside those sealed chambers, the first shape of something terrible was beginning to form. Not just a new creature, not just a new weapon, a new kind of life, born from the marriage of flesh, machine, and the dark side itself. Inside the fortress on Tython, Belia Darzu no longer had to imagine the future. She could build it. For years, the idea had lived only in fragments, ancient alchemical records from Korriban, quiet experiments in hidden chambers. The growing belief that the Sith had misunderstood the dark side by treating it only as a weapon of destruction. Now, surrounded by her own instruments, her own notes, and the silence of a world far from Sith oversight, Darzu began the work she had spent most of her life approaching. She began bringing flesh and machine together, not in the crude way the galaxy already understood. Cybernetics were nothing new. Soldiers who lost limbs received replacements. Warriors enhanced damaged bodies with metal and circuitry. Even among Sith and Jedi, such modifications were sometimes necessary. But these changes were always built on the same assumption. The body remained the body. The machine was only there to assist it. Belia Darzu rejected that idea completely. To her, the divide between organic life and technology was artificial, sheer limit accepted by minds that lacked the courage to challenge it. Flesh failed because it was weak. Machines failed because they lacked life. But if the two could be merged at the deepest level, then each could correct the weakness of the other. That was the principle she now tested in full. The early stages of the work were careful, almost clinical. Darzu selected living subjects and observed their biological structures in detail. Bone density, nerve response, muscular resilience, the capacity of living tissue to heal, adapt, or reject foreign material. Nothing was rushed. Every weakness had to be understood before it could be changed. Then came the first integration trials. Small internal components were introduced into living forms, while Darzu guided the process through both alchemical ritual and Mechu Deru. Dark side energy flowed through the bodies of the subjects, not only forcing adaptation, but also holding the union together long enough for change to begin. The suffering was immense. Living creatures did not welcome such transformation. Flesh resisted metal. Nerves reacted violently. Biological systems convulsed as artificial structures were woven into spaces where nature had never intended them to exist. Many of the early subjects died. Some collapsed before the integration could stabilize. Others survived only long enough to become proof that the method was possible before their bodies failed under the strain. Tissue rejection, organ failure, neurological collapse. The problems were different in each case, but they always returned to the same truth. The process could work. It simply did not work well enough. That would have ended the research for almost anyone else. For Belia Darzu, it became refinement. She changed the sequence of the rituals, altered the timing, strengthened certain mechanical supports while reducing others. She studied how the dark side moved through each stage of the transformation, and where it had to be focused most carefully to keep the living host from breaking apart. Again and again, she repeated the work. Again and again, the failures taught her what raw theory never could. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the results began to change. Some subjects survived longer. Some showed signs of adaptation rather than immediate rejection. Muscle fibers strengthened around artificial reinforcement. Bone structure held under pressures that would once have shattered it. Mechanical inserts no longer behaved like foreign intrusions in every case. Under precise enough control, the body began to treat them as part of its new form. That was the moment Belia Darzu realized she had crossed the true boundary. She was no longer attaching machines to life. She was altering the definition of life itself. The fortress on Tython became a place of endless iteration. Ritual chambers glowed with dark side energy. Workstations filled with anatomical records and mechanical schematics. Every failure was preserved in notes. Every unstable success studied until Darzu understood exactly why it had endured a little longer than the last. No Sith Master guided her. No rival interrupted her. There was only the work. And the terrible sense that she was now walking into territory where even the ancient alchemists of Korriban had never fully gone. Because the bodies in her chambers were no longer just victims of mutation. They were prototypes. The first rough shapes of something the galaxy had never seen before. Not Sith spawn in the old sense. Not beasts simply twisted by rage and ritual. These were becoming something colder. Something engineered. And with every improvement, Belia Darzu felt herself growing further away from the Sith she had once studied under. Their wars suddenly looked small to her. Their ambition looked simple. They still fought for planets, titles, and fear. Darzu was building a power that could outlast all of that. She was learning how to create living weapons that did not merely serve the dark side. They were made by it. The first true success did not arrive as triumph. It arrived as proof. By then, Belia Darzu had already spent long periods inside the fortress on Tython, refining the same brutal process over and over again. Living bodies had been broken, altered, reinforced, and lost in silence. Each failure had brought her closer to understanding where flesh gave way, where machine could support it, and where the dark side had to be forced into the union to keep it alive. Most of her early creations were incomplete. Some survived only briefly, long enough to prove a principle before collapsing under their own unstable design. Others endured the transformation, but emerged too damaged to be useful. Their bodies held, but their minds shattered. They moved without purpose or responded only in violent confusion. Just such beings had value as evidence, but not as servants. Belia Darzu wanted more than survival. She wanted obedience. She wanted creatures that would not merely endure transformation, but become stronger because of it. And eventually, in one of the sealed chambers deep within her fortress, she began to see the first forms of that vision take shape. These new creations were not simply mutated beasts or crude Sith spawn in the ancient style. Their bodies had been redesigned through a harsher and more exact method. Dark side alchemy had reshaped their organic structure, while mechanical systems were woven into them as part of the final form, rather than forced on afterward. Bone was reinforced. Muscle was made stronger. Internal systems were supported by technology that could stabilize what living biology alone could not. And, most important of all, their minds could be held within a tighter web of command. Through the dark side, Belia Darzu imposed control not only over their pain, but over their function. The creatures did not simply live, they responded. That was the difference. That was the moment the old language of Sith alchemy no longer felt large enough to describe what she had made. These beings were something else, part organic, part machine, bound to life but no longer limited by it. The first of them were still imperfect. Their forms were terrifying, unnatural combinations of living tissue and mechanical reinforcement. Movement came with a weight that no natural creature should have carried. Breathing sounded wrong. Limbs ended in structures that belonged more to engineered violence than to nature, yet they endured. More than that, they obeyed. Belia Darzu could feel their presence through the dark side, as something distinct from the unstable creations that had come before. They were not free minds in the ordinary sense. Their will had been narrowed, shaped, and locked toward function. Where previous experiments had slipped into madness or collapse, these beings remained fixed on command. It was not loyalty in the emotional sense. It was deeper than that. They had been built to answer her. And because of that, Darzu finally understood what she had created. Not merely enhanced creatures, not merely alchemical experiments, weapons, living weapons. The name that would one day define them had not yet spread beyond Tython, but the essence of it was already there. Techno-beasts, a word that captured exactly what they were. Beasts remade through technology, animated and stabilized through the dark side, existing only because Belia Darzu had forced flesh and machine to become one. Their existence changed the atmosphere inside the fortress completely. Until now, Darzu had been working toward an idea, a theory, a possibility only she could fully see. Now the possibility moved through her halls. Now it breathed. Now it waited for her commands. She studied them constantly, not with pride, but with cold attention. She measured their endurance, watched their movement, tested their responses, and observed how long the integration remained stable. She was not interested in marveling at what she had done. She wanted to know whether the method could be repeated. That question mattered more than anything, because one successful creation could still be dismissed as an accident. A repeatable process was something far more dangerous. So Belia Darzu refined the work again. She altered designs, changed the balance between machine support and living structure, improved the way command could be imposed through the dark side. With each new success, the creatures became more stable, more effective, and more horrifyingly efficient. And as they multiplied, so did the distance between Darzu and the Sith Order she had once served. There had once been a time when she wanted answers from the Sith. That time was over. Now Belia Darzu possessed something the Order had never given her and would never have allowed her to build. Proof that life itself could be redesigned into obedience. Proof that the old limits were gone. And inside the hidden fortress on Tython, surrounded by the first techno-beasts, Belia Darzu stepped fully into the thing she had been becoming since childhood. Not just a Sith scholar, not just an alchemist, but a creator of living horrors the galaxy had never seen before. The moment Belia Darzu proved that the techno-beasts could survive, her ambition changed again. Until then, the fortress on Tython had been a place of difficult progress. Each success had come slowly, built on failure, patience, and an almost endless series of corrections. But once the first techno-beasts endured their transformation and remained under her control, the question was no longer whether such creatures could exist. The question became how far she could take them. Darzu no longer viewed the beings in her chambers as isolated creations. They were no longer experiments in the ordinary sense. They were the first generation of a new design, one that could be refined, repeated, and eventually used for a purpose far larger than simple proof. That purpose was obedience. Not the weak obedience of soldiers who followed orders out of fear. Not the unstable obedience of Sith apprentices who betrayed their masters the moment ambition outweighed loyalty. Belia Darzu wanted something the Sith Order itself had never truly possessed, servants who could not turn away, and the techno-beasts gave her that possibility. Their forms were terrifying enough, but what mattered more to Darzu was the way they responded to her will. Through the dark side, she could feel the structure of command inside them, not a relationship of trust, not devotion, something colder, more complete. They had been made to answer her. That fact separated them from every ordinary living servant in the galaxy. Flesh alone could fear. Flesh alone could doubt. Flesh alone could imagine rebellion. But these creatures had been reshaped so deeply that obedience was not a choice resting inside them. It was part of their design. And with every passing cycle on Tython, Belia Darzu strengthened that design. She studied how command moved through them, how far her influence could reach, how the dark side bound itself into the altered structures of their minds and nervous systems. When one response proved too slow, she changed the design. When one body showed weakness, she reinforced it. When one creature remained functional longer than the others, she traced every detail of its survival and folded that knowledge back into the next attempt. This was no longer simple alchemy. It was system building. The fortress grew darker with it. Chambers once used for testing became spaces of production. Records filled with new classifications, new structural notes, new refinements in the union of organic tissue and machine. The techno-beasts moved through those halls, like living evidence that Belia Darzu had crossed into territory beyond the rest of the Sith. And slowly, something changed inside her as well. For years, she had stood at a distance from the Sith Order, frustrated by its limits and disappointed by its small imagination. On Tython, that distance became something final. She no longer saw herself as part of the same path. The Sith still fought wars. They still sought rank, dominance, and the praise of masters who feared being replaced. Belia Darzu had gone somewhere else entirely. She was no longer trying to rise within the Order. She was building something outside it. That separation mattered because it changed the meaning of the techno-beasts. They were not merely weapons she might one day offer to the Sith. They were not a service meant to strengthen the Order she had left behind. They belonged to her methods, her fortress, her vision of what the dark side could become when stripped of tradition and used with perfect cruelty. In that sense, the techno-beasts were more than servants. They were a declaration, proof that Belia Darzu no longer needed the Sith to validate her work, proof that she had become dangerous in a way the Order would never tolerate if it fully understood her. Because the Sith could accept monsters. They could even accept forbidden power, as long as that power still served the structure of the Order. But Belia Darzu was creating a force that answered only to one will, her own. That was the true boundary she had crossed. Not just the merging of flesh and machine, not just the creation of living weapons, but independence. The techno-beasts made Belia Darzu less like a Sith Lord serving the old empire, and more like the center of something new, secret and terrifyingly self-contained. And deep inside the fortress on Tython, surrounded by creatures born from pain, machinery, and dark side design, Belia Darzu stood farther from the Sith than she had ever been. The Order had once shaped her. Now she was shaping life itself, and sooner or later, the Sith would learn what she had done. By the time the techno-beasts began moving through the halls of her fortress as stable creations rather than failed attempts, something inside Belia Darzu had changed completely. She no longer thought like an apprentice. She no longer thought like a servant of the Sith Order. And she no longer thought like a scholar, asking whether forbidden things should be studied at all. That part of her life was over. For years, Darzu had moved carefully through the shadows of Sith knowledge, collecting fragments, testing limits, and hiding her discoveries from masters who would have destroyed them before they could fully grow. She had once needed secrecy because she still lived beneath the weight of the Order, its rules, its traditions, its fears. But on Tython, surrounded by the proof of her own success, secrecy no longer felt like submission. It felt like protection. She was not hiding because she doubted herself. She was hiding because the Sith did not deserve to know what she had become. That belief settled quietly into every part of her work. The fortress had become a world of its own, separated from the ambitions of ordinary Sith. There were no rival apprentices in its halls, no masters measuring her worth through cruelty or combat, no rituals performed for spectacle. Everything around her now served a single purpose, the continuation of her research. And that research had already gone further than the Sith would ever willingly allow. The technobeasts had proven that life could be redesigned with far more precision than the old alchemists of Korriban had ever achieved. Flesh could be reinforced. Instinct could be narrowed into obedience. Machine structures could stabilize what living tissue alone could not. Through the dark side, the impossible had become repeatable. That last truth was the one Belia Darzu could no longer ignore. Repeatable, not an accident, not a single miracle buried in secrecy. A method, and once a method exists, permission becomes irrelevant. That was the moment Darzu truly stepped away from the Sith Order in her own mind. She had once imagined that ancient knowledge was something to recover. Then she imagined it was something to complete. Now she had gone beyond both ideas. She was no longer restoring the past. She was building something new. The Sith claimed to seek power above all else, but Belia Darzu had come to see the weakness hidden inside that claim. Most Sith still defined power too narrowly. They wanted to rule worlds, command armies, crush enemies in battle. They saw strength in conquest because conquest was visible, immediate, easy to understand. Darzu had begun to see such ambitions as almost childish. To destroy was simple. To create something the galaxy had never seen before and make it obey, that was power. Not the loud power of war, something colder, something deeper. The dark side, in her view, was no longer just a current of anger and domination moving through the Force. It was structure-breaking energy, a tool that could tear apart the limits built into life and replace them with new ones. It could force change where nature refused it. It could push beyond weakness, beyond decay, beyond the old boundaries that flesh and mortality imposed on all living beings. Once Darzu accepted that fully, she stopped thinking in terms of what was allowed. Allowed by whom? By masters she had already surpassed? By a Sith Order that buried knowledge the moment it became too frightening? By old traditions written by beings who had come close to the truth, but still lacked the patience to finish what they started? No. Belia Darzu no longer asked permission from the dead, and she no longer asked it from the living either. That made her isolation on Tython feel less like exile and more like freedom. Every new refinement in her work widened the distance between herself and the Sith she had once studied under. Their doctrines still mattered in one sense. They had given her the language of the dark side, the archives of alchemy, the first broken map toward this path. But now she was walking beyond the edges of that map. And with each step, her sense of purpose hardened. She did not simply want more knowledge. She wanted authorship. She wanted to become the one who defined what the dark side could do to life itself. That ambition did not come with pride in any ordinary sense. Darzu was not theatrical. She did not stand in her fortress speaking grand declarations to the shadows. Her certainty was quieter than that, more dangerous because of it. She simply went back to her work each day with the calm of someone who no longer recognized any authority above her own results. And in that silence, the next stage of Belia Darzu's transformation began. She was no longer just making creatures. She was beginning to rewrite the meaning of nature itself. Once Belia Darzu stopped thinking of life as something fixed, every creature in the galaxy began to look different to her. Not sacred, not natural, structured. That was the word that guided her now. Structure. Bone was only support. Muscle was only movement. Nerves were only pathways. Organs were only functions arranged in a fragile order that nature had repeated for ages. Most beings accepted that order without question. Even the Sith, for all their arrogance, still treated life as if it arrived with rules that could only be bent so far. Belia Darzu no longer believed that. Inside the fortress on Tython, surrounded by her records and the heavy silence of sealed chambers, she began reducing living bodies into principles. She studied anatomy the way engineers studied machines. Every part had a purpose. Every weakness had a cause. Every failure could be traced. This was where her mind moved furthest away from the old Sith alchemists. They had often worked with anger, instinct, and ritual violence. Their creations were powerful, but they carried the mark of impatience. Flesh was twisted until it became useful, but rarely understood in any complete sense. They forced life into horror and called that mastery. Darzu wanted something colder. She wanted understanding before transformation. That was why her notes grew more complex with each passing cycle. Records of biological endurance, comparisons between natural strength and reinforced support, observations of tissue rejection, neural response, pain thresholds, and adaptation under prolonged dark side exposure. She did not merely create. She measured. The technobeasts moving through her halls were the first proof of success, but to Darzu they were also data, evidence that the old limits could be crossed, and that every stable result revealed another law hidden beneath life itself. She watched them walk, respond, endure, and obey. She examined where their structures held and where strain still remained. She looked for patterns, not marvel, because once the impossible becomes real, it must be studied until it becomes normal. That idea began changing the tone of everything around her. The fortress no longer felt like a hidden laboratory alone. It felt like the center of a new discipline, a place where the dark side was not simply used for punishment or conquest, but for design. Flesh, machine, instinct, decay, adaptation, all of it now existed inside one growing system of thought. And inside that system, the meaning of life itself began to shift. Belia Darzu no longer separated living matter from mechanism in the way most beings did. To her, both were arrangements of function. One was grown, the other was built. But both could be altered. Both could be improved. And if the Force could touch the living, while Meshu Deru extended control into technology, then the line between them was not sacred at all. It was temporary. That belief made her more dangerous than any ordinary Sith Lord, because conquest still accepts the world as it is. A conqueror wants to rule reality. Belia Darzu was beginning to imagine replacing it. In her private thought, flesh was no longer identity. It was a medium, a starting condition. Nature itself became little more than an early draft, one that could be edited, reinforced, corrected, or entirely remade if one possessed enough discipline and dark side will. That was where her research became something close to heresy. Not because the Sith were morally troubled by suffering. They were not. Pain had never frightened the Sith. Mutation had never frightened them. Even monsters had their place in Sith history. What frightened them, though they did not yet fully understand it, was the idea that Belia Darzu was no longer obeying the same assumptions they did. The Sith still believed in power through domination. Darzu was moving toward power through authorship. That difference mattered. Because domination ends when the enemy dies. Authorship remains. A being who learns to redesign life is no longer dependent on the old balance of armies, bloodlines, or biological limits. Such a being begins to stand outside the ordinary cycle of war. They do not simply command strength. They manufacture it. Belia Darzu had not yet spoken this belief aloud to the Sith Order. She did not need to. Her work already carried the meaning for her. Every experiment inside the fortress pushed that truth further. Every stable technobeast made the old idea of nature feel weaker and more incomplete. And quietly, almost without ceremony, Darzu began treating the galaxy itself as unfinished. Not broken, not fallen, simply unfinished. A system waiting for a mind ruthless enough to revise it. That was the place her thoughts had now reached. And once a Sith begins to see life as theory instead of destiny, there are very few lines left that cannot be crossed. The heresy did not begin with a speech. Belia Darzu never stood before the Sith and declared that their understanding of the dark side was too small. She did not gather followers and ask them to abandon the old teachings. She did not need to. The heresy was in the work itself. It lived in the fortress on Tython, in the sealed chambers where flesh and machinery were no longer treated as separate things, and in the growing certainty that Belia Darzu was no longer testing forbidden ideas. She was proving them. That was what made her path so dangerous. The Sith could tolerate many things. They could tolerate cruelty, because cruelty had always been part of their order. They could tolerate betrayal, because betrayal was almost expected. They could tolerate forbidden rituals for as long as those rituals strengthened the Sith and remained under Sith control. But Belia Darzu's work was beginning to challenge something deeper than doctrine. It was challenging the limits the Sith had quietly accepted. For generations, the Order had treated alchemy as a dark art of corruption. It could twist life, weaponize pain, and create monstrosities that served a purpose in war. Yet even the most ambitious Sith had eventually stepped back from it. Not because they lacked hunger, not because they had suddenly grown merciful, but because they had come to believe there were boundaries even the dark side could not safely cross. Belia Darzu was crossing them anyway. The technobeasts were only the beginning. That truth became clearer with each passing cycle inside the fortress. Darzu no longer saw her creations as isolated achievements. She saw them as proof that the old Sith had been wrong in the most important possible way. Life was not something the dark side could merely scar. It was something the dark side could redesign. That belief changed the meaning of every experiment she performed after that point. She was no longer trying to discover whether a body could survive transformation. She was studying what kind of transformation could be made stable, obedient, and useful. She was asking questions that no Sith tradition had prepared for. How much of a living being could be replaced before it became something new? How deeply could instinct be rewritten? How completely could a creature be separated from fear, choice, and rebellion? Each answer pushed her further away from the Sith, who still imagined power in simpler forms. And with every success, the work became harder to hide. There were signs now that movement around Tython had not gone entirely unnoticed. Supply lines shifted. Whispers moved through old Sith channels. Minor questions began to travel from one corner of the Order to another. Nothing open, nothing direct. But enough for Darzu to sense the same pattern she had learned to recognize long ago. The tension was gathering. It had not yet become accusation. But it would, because the Sith understood instinctively when something in their own ranks had begun to change shape in a way they could not control. They may not have known the full details of Darzu's research, but they could feel the outline of its danger. A Sith who withdraws from the Order, builds in silence, and stops seeking permission, is never ignored forever. Belia Darzu understood that as well. Yet the knowledge did not slow her. If anything, it hardened her resolve. That was the clearest sign of how far she had already gone. There had once been a time when discovery by the Order would have meant failure, a reason to conceal, delay, or retreat. Now it meant something else. A countdown. The fortress had become the one place in the galaxy where her vision of the dark side existed in full. Here, the Force was not being used to preserve doctrine or repeat the ambitions of older Sith Lords. Here, it was being used to write over reality itself. Flesh, death, obedience, machine function, all of it could be rearranged under enough pressure, enough knowledge, enough will. That idea was the true heresy, not because it opposed the Sith morally, but because it threatened to make the Sith obsolete. A Dark Lord who conquers worlds still needs armies. A creator of living weapons needs only time. Belia Darzu did not speak those words aloud. She did not need to hear them to know they were true. The fortress around her already contained the evidence. The technobeasts moving through its chambers already embodied the argument. The next phase of her work was already reaching towards something larger than private experimentation. And somewhere beyond the walls of Tython, the Sith Order was beginning to feel that one of its own had gone too far. Not into weakness, into possibility. Fear did not spread through the Sith Order all at once. It rarely did. Among the Sith, suspicion usually came first. Quiet, measured, hidden beneath the usual language of ambition and control. One lord would hear a rumor and dismiss it. Another would notice a pattern and say nothing. A third would begin asking questions, not because they cared about truth, but because they wanted to know whether a rival was gaining power in secret. That was how Belia Darzu first entered their thoughts again, not as an open threat, as a disturbance, a name returning too often from places that should have remained silent. By then, her withdrawal from ordinary Sith life was no longer easy to ignore. She had not risen through the usual channels. She had not attached herself to larger war campaigns in the way ambitious Sith often did. She had not built influence through alliances, titles, or visible conquest. Instead, she had disappeared into private work and come back only through whispers. That alone was enough to make the Sith uneasy, because within the Order, hidden power was often more dangerous than visible power. A Sith Lord marching with armies could be watched, challenged, opposed, but a Sith who vanished into secrecy and produced unknown results somewhere beyond the reach of the Order's normal structures, that was something far worse. The rumors were incomplete, but they were enough. There were stories of creatures seen only briefly, then gone again. Accounts of unnatural servants bound to a single will. Reports that Belia Darzu had established herself on Tython and was no longer simply experimenting with old alchemy, but building something deeper, more stable, more obedient. Some dismissed these rumors as exaggeration. Others did not. The ones who took them seriously arrived at the same thought. If even half of it was true, then Darzu was no longer just dangerous. She was unpredictable. And unpredictability frightened the Sith more than hatred ever could. Hatred was ordinary. Hatred made sense. But Belia Darzu's work was beginning to feel like something the Order did not have language for. They knew alchemy. They knew Sith spawn. They knew what it meant to weaponize the dark side through fear and mutation. What they did not know, what many were only beginning to grasp, was what it meant for one of their own to combine Sith alchemy with technology in a way that could produce repeatable, living weapons. That possibility changed the conversation around her. Quietly at first, then more directly. Among the Sith, the worst fear was never that power existed. It was that power existed outside the proper chain of control. Belia Darzu was not serving the Order with her research. She was not offering her methods to the Dark Lords as a gift to strengthen Sith rule. She was building in isolation, under her own direction, for purposes only she fully understood. That was the moment suspicion became something heavier. Not mere concern. Heresy. Not because she had turned away from cruelty. Not because she had betrayed the dark side. In truth, Belia Darzu remained deeply Sith in the harshest sense. Ruthless. Unmoved by suffering, convinced that life existed to be broken and remade by stronger hands. But she had broken from the one thing the Order valued above all else. Its authority. That was what the Sith could not forgive. Her work implied that the dark side did not belong to their tradition alone. It implied that their buried teachings had not been warnings, but unfinished tools. It implied that the limits they had accepted were not true limits at all, only failures of imagination. And if Belia Darzu was right, then the Sith Order itself had become small. Fear grew from that realization, because fear, among the Sith, is often just wounded pride wearing armor. By the time certain Sith Lords began speaking her name with open concern, Belia Darzu had already crossed too far to return. The fortress on Tython remained active. The Technobeasts remained hers. Her methods continued to deepen in silence. She was no longer a scholar hiding from punishment. She was a rival understanding of what Sith power could become. And once the Order began to see her that way, the shape of the future changed. Belia Darzu could not remain a rumor forever. The Sith would come for answers, then for control, and if control failed, they would come to destroy her. Rumors moved strangely through Sith space. They did not travel like military reports, clear and direct, or like orders passed down from one Dark Lord to another. They moved more quietly than that, through half-finished conversations, through private warnings, through frightened fragments carried from one war camp, one hidden channel, one shadowed court to the next. At first, Belia Darzu's name returned only in pieces, a fortress on Tython. Unnatural creatures. Experiments too secret even for the Sith. No one outside her own walls understood the full shape of what she had made, that the absence of certainty only made the whispers more dangerous. Among the Sith, fear rarely needed proof. It only needed the sense that someone, somewhere, had found a form of power the rest did not control. That was enough. By then, the new Sith Wars had already soaked much of the galaxy in exhaustion and blood. Sith campaigns spread destruction across system after system, while the Jedi and the Republic fought to contain a darkness that never seemed to end. In such an age, cruelty alone did not make Belia Darzu unusual. The Sith were already cruel. They already turned battlefields into graves and measured worth through domination. What made Darzu different was silence. Other Sith announced themselves through conquest. They took planets, gathered followers, and sought titles the way predators sought prey. Their power was visible because they wanted it to be feared. Belia Darzu had chosen another path. She had withdrawn, built in secret, and let the results speak only through rumor. That unsettled the Sith more than open violence ever could. Because secrecy suggested patience, and patience, in the hands of a Sith who no longer seemed to care about rank or approval, looked very much like preparation. As the whispers spread, they began changing shape. Some said Darzu had built an army beneath the surface of Tython. Others claimed she had found a lost art hidden even from the archives of Korriban. A few went further, speaking of creatures that were not fully alive in any natural sense, things made from flesh, machine, and dark side ritual, beings that did not simply obey orders, but existed only to answer her will. The details were inconsistent. The fear was not. In the courts and strongholds of Sith-controlled space, more and more lords began hearing the same question beneath every rumor. What, exactly, was Belia Darzu creating? And an even darker question followed close behind. Was it meant for the enemies of the Sith, or for the Sith themselves? That uncertainty poisoned everything. The Sith were used to betrayal, but betrayal inside the Order usually followed familiar forms. An apprentice killed a master. A rival gathered supporters. A claimant challenged for power openly. Those things fit within the logic of Sith life. Darzu's work did not. If she had truly created living weapons more stable than ancient Sith spawn, if she had truly found a way to merge alchemy with machine design, then the old balance inside the Sith Empire itself was no longer safe. Armies could be counted, fleets could be tracked, rival lords could be watched. But a hidden process for manufacturing obedient horrors? That was something else. Some Sith dismissed the rumors as exaggeration, the usual distortions born from distance and fear. But others, especially those old enough to remember how dangerous buried knowledge could become, did not dismiss them at all. They recognized the pattern too well. Forbidden research, isolation, unreadable ambition, results seen only in fragments. That was how disasters began. And while the rumors spread outward through Sith space, on Tython Belia Darzu continued her work in silence, knowing more than she revealed, and revealing almost nothing at all. She had expected attention eventually, perhaps even wanted it. In the quiet way all creators want the world to feel the weight of what they have made. But attention among the Sith was never neutral. It always became hunger, or fear. And now, far beyond the sealed halls of her fortress, fear was beginning to gather around her name like a storm still too distant to hear clearly, but already moving closer. The Sith did not fear mercy. They did not fear pain. They did not fear creatures twisted into monstrous shapes by the dark side, because the history of the Order was already filled with such things. Korriban itself rested on the bones of beings who had pushed life beyond its natural form and called the result power. What the Sith feared was something harder to name: loss of control. That was why Belia Darzu's name began to trouble them more deeply with every passing report. Not because they suddenly found her work immoral. Morality had never guided the Sith. But because the shape of her ambition no longer fit inside the Order's usual understanding of power. In private chambers and war councils, the same concern began surfacing beneath different words. Some called her reckless. Some called her arrogant. A few, more honest than the rest, called her brilliant. But underneath all of it was the same instinct. Belia Darzu had gone somewhere the Sith could no longer predict. That made her dangerous in a way rival lords usually were not. A rival who sought territory could be opposed with armies. A rival who sought rank could be manipulated through alliances and betrayal. Even an alchemist working in forbidden ways might still be tolerated if their work remained crude enough to serve the Order's wars. But Darzu's silence suggested something else. She was not boasting, not bargaining, not offering her research as tribute to more powerful Sith. She had built a hidden fortress on Tython, withdrawn from the ordinary struggles of the Empire, and allowed only fragments of her work to escape into rumor. That was not the behavior of a servant. It was the behavior of someone building independence. Among the Sith Lords, that realization spread quickly. Those who had once dismissed her as an eccentric scholar now began revisiting older reports about her life, her unusual patience as an apprentice, her fascination with ancient alchemy, her long periods in the forbidden archives of Korriban, her lack of interest in rising through the ordinary chains of command. When placed together, those details no longer looked harmless. They looked like preparation. And preparation, among the Sith, always implied intent. No one yet knew the full scale of what Belia Darzu had made, but enough had been sensed to trouble even the proudest among them. Scouts and informants returned with broken accounts of unnatural servants moving through the shadows of her stronghold. Some spoke of altered beasts, carrying both organic strength and machine resilience. Others described creatures that obeyed with a stillness no ordinary living thing should possess. It was not merely the horror of such beings that mattered. It was their discipline. Ancient Sith spawn had existed before, but they were unstable, often difficult to control, and dangerous even to those who created them. If Darzu had truly solved that weakness, if she had found a way to create creatures that were not only monstrous, but obedient, then she had done more than revive alchemy. She had improved it. That was where suspicion turned into something heavier. Heresy. Not in the religious sense. The Sith were not priests trembling over sacred words. Their idea of heresy was simpler and harsher. It meant power developing outside the chain of authority. It meant knowledge that no longer belonged to the Order, but to one will alone. It meant a Sith becoming too self-contained to be controlled, used, or easily destroyed. Belia Darzu now fit that description perfectly. Some lords argued she should be approached first, questioned, perhaps even persuaded to turn her methods over to the Empire. If her work could strengthen the Sith against the Jedi and the Republic, why destroy it? Why not seize it and make it serve a greater purpose? Others were less patient. They understood something the first group preferred not to admit. A mind like Darzu's would never surrender the core of her work willingly. What she had built on Tython was not a gift prepared for the Sith. It was the expression of a belief that she had gone beyond them. And once the Order sensed that belief, fear sharpened. Because the Sith could endure cruelty. They could endure ambition. But a Sith who no longer recognized the authority of the Order, and who possessed the means to manufacture loyal horrors beyond its reach, that was not a curiosity. That was a threat already taking shape. The decision was not made in anger. That was what made it so final. Among the Sith, anger often ruled the first response to danger. A rival grew too strong, and someone struck too early. An insult was answered with blood. A suspected betrayal became an excuse for open war. But Belia Darzu's case unfolded differently, because the lords now speaking about her understood that rage alone would not be enough. She had to be studied first, measured, then removed. By the time the most influential Sith began discussing her openly, the rumors from Tython had already reached a point where silence looked almost foolish. Too many fragments pointed in the same direction. Too many independent whispers described the same pattern. Hidden research, unnatural creations, absolute obedience, and a fortress growing stronger the longer it remained undisturbed. No one knew everything, but everyone knew enough. That was why the question before the Sith Lords slowly stopped being, what is Belia Darzu doing? It became something else. How long do we allow her to keep doing it? Some still argued for seizure instead of destruction. They believed Darzu's work could be turned into an imperial weapon if enough force were used to bring her under control. In theory, it was a tempting thought. If she had truly created stable living weapons through alchemy and machinery, then such power could be aimed at the Jedi, the Republic, and every enemy still resisting Sith expansion. But that argument carried its own fear inside it. To seize her work, the Sith would first have to approach her as something almost equal. They would have to bargain, or threaten, or invade a fortress they did not fully understand. And if they failed, even once, Belia Darzu would know with certainty that the Order feared her. After that, any chance of controlling her would vanish. Other lords saw the situation more clearly. They recognized that Belia Darzu was no longer simply a secretive Sith researcher. She had become a self-contained source of power. Her fortress on Tython was not just a laboratory. It was the center of an alternative future, one in which life could be redesigned outside the approval of the Sith Empire, and loyalty could be manufactured instead of earned or stolen. That possibility could not be allowed to survive, not because it was evil. The Sith had never objected to evil, because it was independent. And independence, inside the Sith Order, was often treated as the oldest, unforgivable crime. So the conversation darkened. What began as concern turned into strategy. What began as strategy slowly hardened into judgment. Belia Darzu had gone too far into forbidden territory. She had hidden knowledge that should belong to the Empire. She had used ancient teachings in ways no council of Sith Lords had approved. She had built creatures whose loyalty pointed toward one master alone. That last point mattered most. The Sith could accept monstrous power if that power still flowed upward, into the hands of the strongest lords and through the hierarchy of the Order. Darzu's power did not. It circled back to her. It lived in her fortress, answered to her will, and grew farther from imperial control with every passing cycle. That meant the problem was no longer academic. It was political, military, existential. Eventually, the words that had lingered beneath every conversation were spoken plainly. Belia Darzu had to be stopped, not watched, not tolerated. Stopped. The decision did not come with ceremony. No grand announcement moved across Sith space. No public decree named her a traitor. Among the Sith, the most important judgments were often made in shadow and carried out before the wider order even understood what had happened. That was the path now opening around Tython. Scattered interest would become focused attention. Focused attention would become preparation. And preparation, once sharpened by Sith fear, always led to the same place: violence. Far away from those private discussions, Belia Darzu remained inside her fortress, still refining the work that had brought the Order to this point. But the silence around her was changing. The galaxy outside had begun to move, and though she had not yet seen the full shape of the response forming against her, the Sith had already made their choice. The woman who had challenged the limits of life itself would not be allowed to continue forever. The order to destroy Belia Darzu did not move through Sith space like a public campaign. It moved like a knife being drawn in the dark. No banners were raised. No grand proclamations named her an enemy of the Empire. That would have given her time to prepare, to hide what mattered most, or to vanish deeper into the shadows with her knowledge intact. The Sith did not intend to give her that chance. Instead, the response formed in layers. First came watchers, quiet movements through old channels. Informants sent to learn what they could about the fortress on Tython, its defenses, the creatures within it, and the routes by which supplies still reached Darzu's hidden world. Some of those agents never returned. Others came back with only fragments, glimpses of unnatural sentries, sealed halls, and a silence that felt less like emptiness and more like something waiting. That silence troubled the Sith almost as much as the rumors themselves, because fortresses usually revealed something about their masters: vanity, fear, hunger for status. But Tython revealed almost nothing. It was not built to impress. It was built to conceal, to endure, and to protect work that Belia Darzu clearly valued more than any title the Order might once have offered her. That made the stronghold feel less like a Sith palace and more like a wound cut into the edge of the Empire, a place where something had gone wrong and continued growing in darkness. The more the Sith learned, the more carefully they moved. Direct assault was considered, but never lightly. Even incomplete reports suggested that Darzu's creations were not the unstable Sith spawn of older ages. They were disciplined, reinforced, purpose-built. A careless invasion might become exactly what the Order feared most: proof that Belia Darzu's private army could withstand the force of the Sith themselves. That could not be risked. So the trap closing around Tython took shape through caution first. Routes were watched. Contacts were identified. Possible sympathizers were measured for weakness or usefulness. The aim was not only to reach Darzu, it was to isolate her, to cut the fortress away from the wider galaxy until Tython itself became a sealed chamber waiting for violence. In that slow tightening, the true nature of Sith betrayal revealed itself. Belia Darzu had once belonged to this same world of secrecy, ambition, and hidden blades. She had learned its lessons well, perhaps too well. But now those same instincts were being turned against her by an order that had finally decided she was too dangerous to remain alive. There was no grief in that decision, only calculation. Because the Sith did not see themselves as betraying one of their own. They saw themselves as correcting a mistake that had been allowed to grow too large. Yet in a deeper sense, it was betrayal. Belia Darzu had taken the ancient knowledge of the Sith seriously. She had studied what they buried, refined what they abandoned, and followed the dark side further than most among them ever dared. She had become exactly the kind of being Sith history, often praised in words: ruthless, inventive, unafraid of limits. And for that, they now prepared to destroy her. On Tython, the pressure of that unseen movement began to reach the edges of the fortress. Small absences, delays, faint disturbances in patterns Darzu had spent years learning to read. Supply lines did not behave quite the same. Certain outer signals shifted. The silence outside her walls stopped feeling natural. Belia Darzu did not panic. She was too disciplined for that. But she understood signs when they appeared. The Sith were moving. Perhaps not openly yet. Perhaps not with their full strength. But the air around her hidden empire had changed, and she could feel the old shape of danger gathering at last. The Order had stopped merely fearing her. Now it was positioning itself. And deep inside the fortress she had built with such cold patience, among techno-beasts that answered only to her will, Belia Darzu faced the truth she had always known would come. The Sith had finally chosen betrayal over understanding. Tython would not remain hidden much longer. Soon, the fortress would become a battlefield. And when that happened, the creatures born in silence would meet the Order that had come to erase them. The first move against Belia Darzu did not come like a declaration of war. It came like confirmation. For some time, she had already felt the pressure building beyond Tython. Small disruptions, shifts in familiar patterns, silence in places where silence no longer felt natural. Those were the signs she understood best, because she had once lived by them herself. The Sith were creatures of secrecy, long before they were creatures of empire. They watched before they struck. They measured before they destroyed. And now, at last, they were close enough to touch her world. The first assault did not begin at the heart of the fortress. The Sith were too cautious for that. They probed the outer layers first, testing routes, defenses, and response times. They wanted to know whether the stories were true, whether Belia Darzu had truly built something on Tython that could stand against the will of the Order. They did not have to wait long for their answer. The outer regions of her stronghold were silent until they were not. Then, all at once, motion returned to the halls. Hidden systems awakened. Sealed passages opened. And the first servants of Belia Darzu moved to meet the intruders. The Sith who entered Tython expecting a hidden scholar found something else entirely. They found preparation, not panic, not disorder, not the desperate resistance of a cornered exile. Preparation. Darzu had not built her fortress like a palace that could be besieged. She had built it like an organism. Layers of defense were tied to one another. Corridors narrowed the movement of enemies. Chambers opened or sealed according to need. Every space inside the structure seemed less like architecture and more like intention made solid. And moving through that intention were her creations. The first Sith attackers encountered altered servants before they ever reached the deeper chambers. Some had once been living beings in a familiar sense. That familiarity was gone now. Their bodies had been remade for function, reinforced beyond natural endurance, and stripped down to purpose. They did not shout challenges. They did not posture. They moved with the blank certainty of things that existed to obey. That was the first detail that unsettled the Sith most. These were not unstable monstrosities lashing out blindly. They were disciplined. Every movement inside the outer fortress felt coordinated, as if Belia Darzu were not merely defending her stronghold, but conducting it. Through the dark side, she could feel the motion of her servants and techno-beasts alike. She sensed the approach of intruders before they crossed certain thresholds. She understood where the pressure would fall, where force would gather, and where her creations needed to meet it. In that sense, the battle began long before the first heavy clash of bodies and blades. It began in control. The Sith had come to test a rumor. Belia Darzu answered with structure. The first moments of fighting were brutal. but not chaotic. That came later. At first, the struggle carried an almost terrible precision. Small assault groups pushed inward through the outer defenses, expecting resistance from armed guards or hidden traps. Instead, they met living weapons engineered with the patience of years. Reinforced creatures struck with unnatural force. Others endured injuries that should have ended any ordinary life. Some moved with a mechanical certainty that made them feel wrong even before they became deadly. The Sith cut many of them down, but not easily and not without cost. That was the turning point in the minds of those who had doubted the rumors. Because in those first exchanges, they saw with terrible clarity that Belia Darzu had done more than create horror. She had stabilized it. The old history of Sith alchemy had always been marked by instability. Sith spawn could be terrifying, but they were rarely precise. They could turn on handlers, lose shape, become liabilities as quickly as they became assets. What moved through the fortress on Tython did not feel like that. It felt intentional. That was when fear began changing into something heavier inside the attackers. Recognition. Belia Darzu had not merely wandered too far into forbidden knowledge. She had learned from the failures of generations before her. She had taken what the Sith buried and brought it into war in a form the Order had never truly faced. And still, the deeper army had not yet emerged. This was only the edge of her defense. Only the first hard answer to the quiet violence the Sith had brought to her door. Inside the heart of the fortress, Belia Darzu remained calm. She did not rush to meet them with spectacle. She observed, adjusted, directed. For all the years she had spent building life in secret, the moment had finally come when that secret had to prove itself against the people who had once claimed ownership over every dark path she walked. Now, they would see what she had become. And on Tython, as the first assault broke itself against the outer strength of her hidden empire, the war between Belia Darzu and her own kind truly began. What the Sith found beneath Belia Darzu's fortress was not a laboratory struggling toward success. It was an army already waiting. The hidden stronghold on Tython was not only a place of study, it also served as barracks for the forces Darzu had created, an obedient host of technobeasts known as the Metanecrons, built through Sith alchemy and Metu Daru, and later unleashed during the Sictus Wars. That was the truth the first assault only brushed against. The outer defenders had already shown the Sith that Belia Darzu's work was real, but the deeper levels of the fortress revealed something far worse. This was never meant to be a hidden refuge for one rogue scholar. It was a military stronghold. A black durasteel complex on Tython, built to contain laboratories, inner sanctums, and housing for the creatures she had shaped into weapons. As the attackers pushed further inward, they began to understand what her years of silence had been hiding. The corridors opened into larger internal chambers, and there the scale of her preparation became impossible to deny. Not one or two unstable horrors. Not scattered experiments left half-finished in glass and shadow. Rows of altered beings, hulking forms of flesh and machinery, bodies strengthened beyond natural design, made not just to endure pain, but to continue functioning through it. These were the technobeasts the Sith had whispered about for so long, living hybrids of metal and flesh, created from Darzu's nanogene corruption and bound through the dark side to her will. The sight changed the battle immediately. Until then, some of the Sith still may have hoped the rumors had been distorted, that Darzu had only rediscovered old alchemy in some limited form, that what waited inside Tython would be powerful, yes, but still familiar enough to destroy and forget. That illusion did not survive the deeper halls, because the army beneath her fortress was not behaving like old Sith spawn. Ancient Sith spawn had always carried the weakness of instability. They were terrifying, but often too savage, too crude, too difficult to direct in prolonged war. Darzu's creations were different. The technobeasts moved in waves, but not blindly. They answered a single design. They were not merely released, they were directed. And as the Sith forces advanced, they found themselves fighting creatures that seemed less like monsters and more like manufactured intent. That was what made the atmosphere inside the fortress so unnatural. Every chamber felt connected to Belia Darzu herself. The Metanecrons did not need shouted orders. They did not hesitate, scatter, or break from fear. Through the dark side, their obedience ran deeper than discipline. It was part of what they were. The army hidden beneath Tython had not been gathered through loyalty or intimidation. It had been built through transformation. And Belia Darzu could feel it all. Every impact in the corridors, every breach in the outer defenses, every motion of the creatures she had shaped over years of cold patience. While the Sith entered her fortress believing they were moving deeper into enemy territory, they were in truth descending further into a system already alive with her command. That was why the battle began changing from assault into nightmare. The first attackers had expected resistance. They had not expected multiplication. For every fallen defender, more shapes emerged from deeper chambers, from barracks, from sealed passages hidden inside the architecture of the stronghold. The fortress was not simply protecting an army. It had been designed around one. The deeper the Sith advanced, the more the stronghold revealed what it had always been built for. Not retreat, not secrecy alone, but deployment. And in that moment, Belia Darzu's true ambition stood exposed. She had not withdrawn from the Sith Order merely to hide. She had withdrawn to create a force the Order itself could not match with certainty. An army not of followers, but of obedience made flesh. A host that answered neither fear nor ambition, but only design. The Metanecrons were proof that her work had already gone beyond experiment and become campaign. Wikipedia's summaries of her reign are blunt on this point. The Technobeasts became the defining horror of the Sictus Wars. So when the Sith pressed deeper beneath her fortress, they were no longer hunting one heretic. They were stepping into the jaws of a war machine she had been building in silence for years. And only then did they begin to understand the full meaning of the choice they had made. They had not come to suppress a scholar. They had come to war against something Belia Darzu had already turned into an army. Once the deeper chambers of Tython opened and the full scale of Belia Darzu's army became visible, the battle stopped feeling like a suppression effort. It became a war. The creatures flooding those halls were not only bodyguards or defensive beasts. They were the Metanecrons, Darzu's techno-beast army, created through Sith alchemy, Metru Deru, and the nanogene corruption she had developed in secret. Legends material describes them as the defining terror of the Sictus Wars, the long and brutal campaign Belia Darzu waged during the late New Sith Wars. That was the true nightmare now unfolding on Tython. The Sith had come expecting to destroy a rogue alchemist before her work spread any further. Instead, they found themselves standing inside the first full expression of that work. The war beasts of older Sith history had always been terrible, but they were still crude. Darzu's creations were something colder. They were not just corrupted, they were engineered. They had been built to survive, built to obey, and built to keep advancing long after ordinary life would have collapsed. So when battle spread through the fortress, it did not unfold like a normal clash between Sith rivals. It unfolded like a system activating. The halls of Tython became channels for violence. Technobeasts surged through reinforced corridors in coordinated waves. Some were once humanoid, others had been shaped from larger living stock, then remade into heavier forms of attack and endurance. Wikipedia's summaries of Darzu's work note that living subjects of multiple species were exposed to the nanogene process inside the fortress, including humanoids and larger beasts. That variety mattered in battle. It meant the defenders of the fortress were not a single breed of creature with one weakness to exploit. They were an alchemical arsenal, different bodies bent toward different purposes. Some struck with speed, some absorbed punishment, some forced the attackers to slow down and fight at close range, where the confined architecture of the fortress worked in Darzu's favor. And through all of it, Belia Darzu remained at the center, not necessarily standing in the middle of every corridor with a blade in hand, but present through command. The creatures in her stronghold were not just guarding territory, they were extensions of her will. That is the detail that makes her war feel so disturbing even in summary. The alchemy was not only physical, it was hierarchical. She had built an army whose loyalty was not political, emotional, or ideological. It was structural. That made the fighting more frightening for the Sith pressing inward. Ordinary troops can break. Ordinary beasts can panic. Ordinary servants can betray. Darzu's army did none of those things. The battle, therefore, became a kind of revelation. Every chamber won by the Sith showed them another layer of what Belia Darzu had accomplished in silence. Every techno-beast cut down proved not that her methods had failed, but that they were real enough to require direct and costly destruction. Every wave of altered flesh and machinery forced the Order to face a humiliating truth. One of their own had carried forbidden Sith knowledge further than they had dared to follow. And in that revelation, the battle lost whatever purity it might once have claimed. This was no longer the Sith defending tradition against one dangerous heretic. This was the Sith fighting a mirror of themselves, a darker refinement of their own oldest instincts, cruelty without hesitation, creation without mercy, power stripped of all restraint. That was why the war on Tython felt so unnatural. Belia Darzu had taken Sith alchemy, which earlier generations treated as an unstable dark art, and dragged it into organized warfare. She had fused it with machinery, turned it into process, and then given that process an army-sized body. In lore summaries, the Technobeasts are remembered not as a side experiment, but as the signature horror of her era. So as blood, metal, and dark side violence filled the fortress halls, the Sith finally began to understand what Belia Darzu had truly done. She had not just created monsters, she had weaponized a new idea of life. As the battle spread through Tython, the Sith finally saw the full shape of Belia Darzu's ambition. Not in theory, in flesh, in metal, in the things moving through her fortress that should never have been alive at all. By then, her technobeasts were no longer scattered proofs of concept. They were the metanecrons, an organized army created through Sith alchemy, Metu Deru, and the nanogene spore, and they formed the front line of her power during the Sictis Wars. That was the moment the Sith understood how far Belia Darzu had gone. She had not simply revived an old forbidden art. She had improved it. Ancient Sith alchemists had created horrors before, but their creations were unstable, difficult to control, and often as dangerous to their masters as to any enemy. Darzu solved the very weakness that had caused earlier generations to bury this knowledge. Her technobeasts were bound to her will, housed in barracks within her hidden fortress, and created in numbers large enough to sustain a real war effort. That changed the meaning of the battle entirely. The Sith had come to Tython thinking they were confronting a rogue scholar, perhaps even a dangerous one. But what stood before them was not a scholar hiding behind theory. It was a Dark Lord who had already built a new military logic out of flesh and machinery. Living victims from multiple species had been subjected to the nanogene process inside the fortress, transformed into obedient hybrids that no longer belonged to nature in any ordinary sense. And in that realization, fear became something more humiliating. Recognition. Belia Darzu had taken ancient Sith teachings more seriously than the Sith themselves. She had followed alchemy past corruption, past mutation, and into system. She had turned a buried dark art into production. She had made monsters that could spread their own transformation further by infecting other victims with the nanogene spore. That was why the war on Tython felt so unnatural. This was not merely violence. The Sith already understood violence. This was authorship. Every technobeast moving through those halls was evidence that Belia Darzu no longer accepted the old limits of life, death, flesh, or machine. She had begun treating living beings as material that could be rewritten, then weaponized that belief against the galaxy. The technobeasts were later remembered as the defining horror of the Sictis Wars for exactly that reason. And somewhere in the center of that fortress, Belia Darzu stood surrounded by the proof of her own heresy. The Sith had feared she was building something beyond their control. Now, they knew. She had not only crossed the line they feared, she had erased it. The fortress did not fall in a single moment. It began to fail the way living things fail, slowly at first, then all at once. By the final stage of the Sictis Wars, Belia Darzu was still fighting from her hidden stronghold on Tython, the same fortress where she had built her technobeasts and gathered the metanecrons around her will. But the pressure against her had become relentless. Her enemies were no longer dealing with rumor or fragments. They were answering a real threat, and they meant to break it. The Sictis Wars themselves would end only with her death on Tython in 1230 BB. Inside the fortress, the signs of collapse began to multiply. Defenses that had once held with cold precision were forced again and again into open strain. Chambers were breached. Corridors that had once served as controlled killing grounds now became wounds driven deeper into the heart of her stronghold. Every assault cost her something. Not only creatures, not only territory, but time. And time had always been the one resource her work demanded most. Belia Darzu understood what was happening. She had built the fortress to hide knowledge, protect process, and shelter creation. Now that same place was becoming a grave for the things she had made. The army that had once defined the horror of the Sictus Wars could still fight, but even her techno-beasts could not hold forever against an enemy that refused to stop. And as the walls of Tython began to give way, Belia Darzu faced the truth she had spent years delaying. Her work had finally met its limit in war. One by one, the things Belia Darzu had built to outlast nature began to die. That was the cruelty hidden inside the fall of her fortress. For years, the techno-beasts had been the proof that her vision worked. They were the metanecrons, the front line of her power during the Sictus Wars, created through Sith alchemy, Mechu, Daru, and the nanogene spore. They had carried her war outward from Tython and made her name something feared across the conflict. Now, they were being cut down inside the same stronghold that had once sheltered their creation. The deeper the enemy pushed into Tython, the more her army was forced into direct attrition. The fortress still held layers of defense, but defense was no longer enough. Every breached chamber became another place where one of Darzu's creations met the limit she had spent her life trying to erase. Flesh reinforced by machinery still tore apart. Bodies stabilized by alchemy still fell. Even obedience could not save them from destruction forever. That was the tragedy Belia Darzu had never allowed herself to face. She had believed she was building a form of life stronger than the natural one, more durable, more exact, less vulnerable to fear, pain, or betrayal. But the collapse of Tython exposed a harsher truth. Her creations could be improved. They could be weaponized. They could even spread the nanogene infection to make more of themselves. Yet they could still be lost in war, one after another, under enough pressure. Inside the falling fortress, the death of the metanecrons was not just military defeat. It was the slow destruction of Belia Darzu's argument with nature. As defeat closed around her, Belia Darzu still did not choose escape. That may be the clearest sign of who she had become. A lesser Sith might have fled Tython with whatever knowledge could still be carried. Another might have abandoned the fortress, sacrificed the remaining techno-beasts, and hidden somewhere deeper in Sith space to begin again. Survival was, after all, the first instinct of almost every Sith. They betrayed others, vanished, and rebuilt when they had to. Belia Darzu did something colder. She stayed with the work. By the final phase of the Sictus Wars, her fortress on Tython had become both laboratory and battlefield. The same halls that once sheltered alchemy, Mechu Daru, and techno-beast creation were now under direct assault. Yet Darzu remained tied to the place, because it held what mattered most to her: the process, the records, and the knowledge she had spent years building. Later accounts remember the fortress not just as her refuge, but as the center of her research, and the site of her death in 1230 BB. That choice reveals something painful. Belia Darzu had begun this path seeking understanding, then mastery, then authorship over life itself. By the end, the work had replaced every other instinct. Her creations were falling. Her defenses were breaking. The Sith were closing in. But to Darzu, abandoning the research would have meant admitting that survival mattered more than what she had discovered. She could not do that. And so, while Tython burned around her, Belia Darzu chose the one thing she had always chosen in the end. Not safety, not surrender, the work. In the end, Belia Darzu was not defeated by doubt. She was defeated by time, pressure, and betrayal. The Sictus Wars ended in 1230 BB when Darzu was assassinated on Tython, and the sources tie that death to the Macrosa Order, along with betrayal from her own Sith followers. Her death crippled the metanecrons and ended the campaign she had built around her techno-beast army. That ending matters, because Belia Darzu had spent her life trying to prove that flesh could be corrected, that nature could be improved, and that obedience could be built more reliably than it could ever be inspired. She came closer than most Sith ever had to making that belief real. Her fortress on Tython became the center of that dream, and her techno-beasts became the most terrifying proof of it. But when the final moment came, none of that knowledge saved her. The creator of artificial loyalty died in the oldest Sith way possible, through conspiracy. And yet, even in death, Belia Darzu did not vanish completely. Her fortress remained, her secrets remained, her holocron remained hidden on Tython for centuries until Darth Bane later came searching for it. That is the final irony of her life. The woman who tried to rewrite the meaning of life could not preserve her own future, but fragments of her work endured long enough to shape Sith history after her. So the end of Belia Darzu was not just the death of a Sith alchemist. It was the fall of a mind that believed the galaxy itself could be redesigned, and the beginning of a legacy the Sith would never fully bury. After Belia Darzu died on Tython in 1230 BB, the noise around her finally stopped. The campaigns ended. The war she had shaped through the metanecrons collapsed with her, and for the first time in years, her fortress became quiet again. But it was not the quiet of peace. It was the quiet left behind when something terrible has ended, and something even more terrible has been left untouched. The Sith did not gather there to celebrate her fall. They had won, but victory brought them no comfort. They had seen what Belia Darzu had built in secret, a hidden stronghold on the deep core world of Tython, a place where Sith alchemy and Mechu Deru had been fused into a single discipline, and where creatures of flesh and machinery had been turned into obedient weapons. Now that fortress remained standing without its creator, that fact mattered, because the death of Belia Darzu had not erased the knowledge inside those halls. Her laboratories, inner sanctum, and personal holocron still remained there after the assassination. Even worse, later accounts say the dark side power of her holocron continued to radiate through the fortress, drawing the surviving techno-beasts toward it. So the silence after Tython was not empty. It was watchful. Belia Darzu was gone, but the place that had shaped her greatest discoveries still breathed with her presence, as if the fortress itself refused to admit that its master was dead. The Sith understood that destroying Belia Darzu was only half the task. The other half was making sure no one ever finished what she had started. So after her death, they moved through the fortress, not like victors claiming a prize, but like survivors entering a contaminated wound. What they found there was too dangerous to leave untouched. Laboratories, sealed chambers, records of techno-beast creation, and above all the knowledge preserved in her stronghold and her holocron. Her fortress on Tython remained the center of her experiments even after the assassination, and later sources make clear that her holocron endured there as the most important surviving piece of her work. That is why the Sith did not simply occupy the place. They buried it, not necessarily by erasing every wall or burning every chamber, but by sealing the knowledge behind fear, distance, and silence. The logic was simple. Belia Darzu had come too close to mastering something the Order itself did not fully control. The union of Sith alchemy, Mechu Deru, and engineered life. Her techno-beasts had already proven that this was no longer theory. It was method. And method can be repeated. That was what frightened them most. A single dead alchemist could be mourned, hated, or forgotten. A repeatable process for creating obedient horrors was something else entirely. So the Sith treated her research the way they had always treated the most dangerous truths in their history. They hid it, where only the reckless, the desperate, or the brilliant would ever try to reach it again. Over time, Belia Darzu's fortress became something more than a ruined stronghold. It became a warning. The Sith had sealed her work away, but sealing was never the same as forgetting. They knew too well what still remained inside those halls. Not only records and chambers, but the memory of a mind that had gone further than any of them wished to admit. A fortress like that could not simply be treated as abandoned stone. It had to be feared. And so fear became its true guard. Not lines of soldiers. Not banners. Not the proud occupation of a conquered enemy. The fortress endured in silence, hidden beneath layers of distance, secrecy, and reputation. Its name carried the same weight as a tomb no one wanted opened, because everyone understood the same terrible truth. Belia Darzu had died. Her ideas had not. That was what made the place feel haunted. Even without spirits, every sealed chamber suggested unfinished work. Every dark corridor hinted that something inside the fortress had survived longer than it should have. The Sith had destroyed her army, broken her campaign, and ended her life. But none of that could guarantee that her knowledge was truly dead. So they left it buried beneath fear. A tomb not only for a Sith alchemist, but for a possibility too dangerous to face directly. And that may have been the clearest sign of how much Belia Darzu had changed them. Even after killing her, the Sith still did not trust themselves enough to stand too close to what she had built. Over time, Belia Darzu's fortress became something more than a ruined stronghold. It became a warning. The Sith had sealed her work away, but sealing was never the same as forgetting. They knew too well what still remained inside those halls. Not only records and chambers, but the memory of a mind that had gone further than any of them wished to admit. A fortress like that could not simply be treated as abandoned stone. It had to be feared. And so fear became its true guard. Not lines of soldiers, not banners, not the proud occupation of a conquered enemy. The fortress endured in silence, hidden beneath layers of distance, secrecy, and reputation. Its name carried the same weight as a tomb no one wanted opened, because everyone understood the same terrible truth. Belia Darzu had died. Her ideas had not. That was what made the place feel haunted, even without spirits. Every sealed chamber suggested unfinished work. Every dark corridor hinted that something inside the fortress had survived longer than it should have. The Sith had destroyed her army, broken her campaign, and ended her life. But none of that could guarantee that her knowledge was truly dead. So they left it buried beneath fear. A tomb not only for a Sith alchemist, but for a possibility too dangerous to face directly. And that may have been the clearest sign of how much Belia Darzu had changed them. Even after killing her, the Sith still did not trust themselves enough to stand too close to what she had built.